Christmas at the Cove. Heartwarming women's fiction. Five Island Cove, Book 4. Written by Jessie Newton. Narrated by Jill Smith. Chapter 12. AJ's head ached in such a way that she'd never experienced before. Her stomach existed in a pinched state she couldn't quite get rid of. First, she'd thought she was hungry, but eating only made her feel sicker. Not eating made her feel lightheaded. She found herself back in the kitchen with everyone else, helping to clean up the breakfast dishes. Robin, Alice, and Laurel talked easily, as if they'd known each other for years. AJ supposed they might have, as she hadn't been in the cove for a while. Alice had always made friends easily, and everyone loved Robin on sight. She had a special way of making everyone feel like they belonged right where they were. AJ just listened to Laurel tell the story of her and Paul's first date as she picked up washing the dishes she'd left to go listen to Eloise talk to Aaron. The inn had a homey, welcoming feeling about it, and AJ felt like she could spend a lot of time here and be very happy. Matt had gone upstairs to help others get packed up and loaded up, and he'd been trying to get in touch with his parents for a couple of hours to find out how their house and the golf course on Diamond Island had fared. AJ hated this quiet, seething feeling just beneath her skin. She didn't like being disconnected from those she wanted to speak with. She'd grown so accustomed to having everyone and everything only a tap or a swipe away, and she found herself reaching to check her phone, though it hadn't buzzed, chimed, or rung for over 12 hours now. Eloise came bustling back into the kitchen, and she came to stand next to AJ. "Thank you so much, AJ." She put her arm around AJ and squeezed. AJ grinned as a little grunt came out of her mouth. "Of course, Eloise. I'm so glad you got to talk to Aaron." "Me too." Eloise pulled in a big breath and exhaled it right back out. "I don't want to ever go through worry like that again." She started drying the plates AJ washed clean. "I've been meaning to ask you how the freelancing is going. You haven't said much lately on the group chat." "Oh, well, that's because I haven't been doing much lately," AJ said. How could she tell her friends she'd been in the cove for over a week now? She hated feeling like she'd done something wrong when she just needed the time with Matt as they sorted through some complicated things. "Do you want to get married?" He'd asked her that question last night, only a few moments before she'd gone through a full-blown panic attack about being a wife and mother, right here in the cove. She'd been working through a lot with her therapist, but they hadn't even touched the subject of her mother yet. Her father either. "No jobs out there?" Eloise asked. "You were so busy when you first started." "There's been jobs," AJ said, glancing at Eloise. Did you ever just come to the cove and not tell anyone?" Eloise stopped drying, but AJ kept her focus on the plate, not able to bear the full weight of Eloise's eyes. "Sometimes," she said. "When I'd come to see Aaron, I wouldn't tell my mother." She leaned a little closer and lowered her voice. "Sometimes I wouldn't even tell Robin." She smiled and gave a light laugh. "What secrets are you two sharing?" Robin asked. "See what I mean?" Eloise muttered under her breath, and AJ handed Robin the next clean, dripping wet plate. "Nothing," Eloise said in a chirpy, louder voice. "What are you, Alice, and Laurel talking about?" "The first time we met our significant other," Robin said. "We want to hear your stories, too." She grinned at Eloise and then AJ. "I think you ran into Matt at the grocery store, right?" "Yes," AJ said, her smile genuine for perhaps the first time that day. She related the story of their reconnection in the produce section of all places, and as she said, "And he wouldn't let me leave without giving him my number, said he didn't want to let me get away for a second time," she knew she wanted to marry him. She turned away from the sink. "I need to tell you guys something," she said, swallowing a moment later. "I wish Kelly were here." As if summoned by her wish, every device in the kitchen started making noise. Bleeps and snaps and crackles sounded for several seconds, and as AJ looked around, surprised, Alice said, "I guess the cellular network is back." She plucked her phone from the pocket of her wide-leg beachcombers and looked at it. AJ did the same, though she was wearing a pair of elastic waistband pants that had plenty of breathing room in the leg and hip. She'd never be able to pull off Alice's classy without trying look. Whatever AJ did, it looked like she'd tried dang hard to achieve it. "I have a bunch of texts from Aaron and my mother," Eloise said. "My dad is okay," Alice said, exhaling heavily. "They're up on the cliff, but they had water surge up to 4 feet in their house." "Oh, my word," Robin said. She looked from Alice back to her phone. "Duke's at my mother's house. She's on that cruise, you know. Look." She turned her device so they could all see. The lawn held puddles in plenty of places, and the front porch sagged heavily to the right because the pillar there was broken. Robin scrolled, and the pictures just got worse and worse. "She lives at sea level," Robin said. "It looks like a total loss." She sniffled, and that stole AJ's attention from the phone to her friend's face. "Just like Duke's boat." Her eyes crinkled as her face crumpled, and AJ stepped right into her to hold her up. Robin clung to her in a most un-Robin-like way. AJ always considered Robin to be the most put together of all of them, even if Alice looked like it on the outside. On the inside, and in real life, it was Robin who had all the right pieces in all the right places. Alice hugged her from the other side, and AJ met her eyes. No, she didn't know what to do. She hadn't done any articles recently, and she didn't have the money to replace a fishing boat. They were terribly expensive, and Robin and Duke's best means of supporting their family. "My father is going to check on the house for me," Alice said. "I'm sure the one on Diamond is in ruins, too." "Kelly probably lost her place," Eloise said. "Look, anyone can just stay here. There's probably going to be 1,000,000 cancellations because of the airports and ferries anyway. Maybe I should just delay the opening overall." "No," Robin said, pulling away from AJ's embrace. "Don't do that, Elle. We're going to get this place put back together for you, and it's going to be an amazing Christmas." She nodded like that was that, and AJ had seen Robin make such things come true in the past. "When everyone gets here, we're going to hang all those Christmas balls on the gutters, and we're going to put up the tree. You'll see. It's going to be the best Christmas the Cove has ever seen." AJ looked at her phone again, most of her messages from Kelly. Sharp guilt gutted her once more, and AJ actually tapped to start a new text to her father. She needed to find some measure of relief in her familial relationships, especially if she was going to do what Matt had suggested. Move back to the Cove and raise their baby with him. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, pausing Alice, who'd started to say something about how she wasn't going to climb any ladders to decorate the inn for the holidays. Every eye zeroed in on AJ, whose heart danced through her chest in a strange triple-beat waltz. "Excuse me?" Alice asked, one hand fluttering near her throat. She wore an expression AJ knew well. It showed the shock and fear that had flowed through AJ when she'd gotten the phone call from her doctor. "Is the baby—" Robin didn't finish, and AJ hated that the unsaid question even needed to be asked. AJ swallowed back her irritation. She couldn't live her life one way and expect a completely opposite reaction to certain news items. "Matt and I are talking about getting married," she said, "living here and raising the baby." She couldn't swallow back the rising panic, at least not physically. She did look away from everyone and press her eyes closed. She could breathe in through her nose and out through her mouth, trying to find the center of her mind and focus on the good things there. A light touch on her forearm had her opening her eyes. "Congratulations, AJ," Laurel said. "What great news for you and Matt." She wore a warm, friendly smile that somehow had AJ in tears. It was exactly the kind of gesture Kelly would have said and done, and AJ missed her best friend so powerfully in that moment. "Thank you," she murmured. "Yes," Alice said. Congratulations, AJ. I'm thrilled for you. Me too, Robin said. As am I, Eloise said, but she didn't turn from the sink. Congrats. The word came flying over her shoulder, and AJ knew the news of her pregnancy had caused turmoil for Eloise. She disliked that, just as she disliked the false smile on Robin's face and the sympathetic one on Alice's. Instant fury spiked through her. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected from her best friends. This was why she'd hunkered down inside Matt's house, drifted aimlessly online, and hadn't told anyone she'd come to the Cove early. What? AJ asked. I'm not allowed to have a baby because my mother was so terrible? AJ, Alice said, her eyes widening. Of course not. That's what you're all thinking, isn't it? My mother abandoned me and my siblings, and I'm going to do the same to this baby. Well, I'm not. I don't think that, Robin said, actually puffing her chest out. Why would any of us think that? AJ looked around at Alice, Robin, and Eloise, who had turned from the sink now. She felt like a wild animal who'd been caged after experiencing life on the savannah, and she needed to get out. She needed to get out now. Excuse me, she said, her stomach lurching and her chest tightening so much the last word sounded choked in her throat. She turned to leave just as the door opened. Kelly walked in, and she looked tired, yet fierce and strong and absolutely beautiful. AJ burst into tears and ran toward her, saying, Kelly, I'm so glad you're okay. She engulfed the shorter, petite woman in a hug and clung to her while she cried. I'm just a mess right now because I'm pregnant and I don't know how to be a mother and everything is going to fall apart and then I'm going to be left alone again, but this time I'll have a baby I don't know how to take care of. Perhaps that was how her mother had felt. Inadequate, broken, a failure. AJ felt all three of those keenly, and she added, And I had to go off all of my medications, and for the love of all that's holy, I just need a drink and a fistful of pills. Kelly stepped back, but she didn't let go of AJ's shoulders. She searched her face, which was surely a mess, and asked, You're pregnant? AJ nodded, her chin quivering all over again. A smile filled Kelly's face, and it was like watching the sun rise over calm water. It was glorious and filled with light and acceptance. Oh, congratulations, AJ! What an amazing thing! She hugged her again, and AJ started to believe that her pregnancy was an amazing thing, because Kelly had said it was. Someone pressed in behind her, and AJ didn't mind the sandwich hug. It reminded her of her younger days when she'd score a goal and her teammates would pile in for a celebratory hug. You're going to be an amazing mother, Alice said, her voice soft and absolutely genuine. And when you struggle, because we all do, you'll have all of us right here to help you. We're thrilled for you, Robin said, and the group jostled as she added herself to the huddle hug. Please don't think we're not, even for a moment. I've always wanted a baby, Laurel said. I don't know you super well yet, AJ, but I think you're going to do just fine. Yes, Eloise said. Sorry I reacted so strangely, AJ. I didn't mean to make you feel bad. AJ was taller than all the other women in the kitchen, and she twisted to look at Eloise. Something warred in her expression, and AJ knew exactly how she felt. It was the exact same turbulent, unsettling, unnamed feeling AJ had experienced several times in her life. Whenever a girlfriend got engaged, AJ was beyond happy for her. She simply wanted the same thing for herself, and it had always felt unattainable and just out of her reach. For Eloise, motherhood probably was completely out of her reach. You have Grace and Billy, Laurel said. Those girls are lucky to have you, let me tell you. Did you know their mother? Robin asked. Laurel nodded, a hard-as-flint glint in her eye. Trust me, Eloise. Aaron hit the jackpot when he sicked his dog on you. Wait, AJ said. Aaron sicked his dog on you? Eloise started to giggle, and that set off a chain reaction that moved through all 6 of them like wildfire. Before she knew it, AJ was laughing so hard her stomach hurt for an entirely new reason. Movement by the door caught her eye, and she found Matt standing there with Paul and Aaron. She grinned at them, well aware of how she was now up on the swing, which meant down was the only way to go. Right now, it didn't matter. She nodded toward the doorway and said, "El, Aaron's here." Eloise sucked in a breath. "Oh." She ran her hands through her hair and practically danced over to Aaron, who took her straight into his arms and kissed her. AJ sighed, a content little sigh, because she was so happy for Eloise, who had waited as long as she had to find her one true love. Matt grinned as he came toward her. "What's so funny, Ava Jane?" "Nothing," she said, smiling up at him as he wrapped one arm around her waist. They swayed together, and he put his hand flat against her stomach, a look of adoration that AJ had never seen on a man's face before, at least when they were looking at her. "I want to marry you," she said, the moment sobering. "I love you, and I want to marry you, live here in the cove, and raise our baby together." Plenty of fear ran through her veins, but AJ was tired of giving in to it. She wasn't her mother, and it was time to stop thinking her future only held sadness and misery.
Chapter 13. Alice's phone rang with the shrill, old-fashioned ring she'd assigned to her business number just as she put a bite of the lemon donut in her mouth. She breathed in, which was a big mistake, as the outside of the donut had a healthy amount of powdered sugar on it, which was now floating in her lungs. She coughed and choked, the ringing so loud it hurt her ears. "Mom," Charlie moaned from the bed where he still slept. But Alice wasn't focused on letting him sleep at nearly 11 o'clock in the morning. Breathing was more important. Staying alive trumped his sleep schedule. Ginny said, "I'll get you a drink," and she bustled into the bathroom in their suite at the Cliffside Inn. They'd been amazing over the past day, as everyone had to pitch in and help to get all the extra guests out the door. Some had family and friends they could stay with, but the large majority had gone to see what had become of their homes, cottages, bungalows, and apartments. The ferry system was operational now, but only on a holiday schedule, as Will had lost several boats, with many more which needed repairs. Alice had finally spoken to him last night, and he'd told her all about it. She sure did like talking to him. And while she'd agreed to go to dinner with him, she didn't see that happening in the immediate future. She'd spoken to Eloise and Robin, and they'd both agreed that she could invite him to their dinner on the last night they'd be at the inn. She'd done that, and he'd said he'd do whatever was necessary to be there. Alice's eyes watered as she finally got the powdered sugar out of her lungs. The phone stopped ringing as Ginny returned with the water, and Alice gulped it. "Sorry," she finally said, her voice sounding rusted and overused at the same time. "Time to get up anyway, Charlie. I want to talk to you two about something." Ginny crossed the room and pulled open the curtains, and Alice squinted into the bright sunlight. It wouldn't be that warm outside, but it was nice to be reminded she didn't live in a cave.
"Fine,"
Charlie grumbled, sitting up and kicking off his blankets. Alice checked the number on her phone, but it wasn't one of her known clients. She got calls from numbers she didn't know all the time, though, and she wished she'd been able to answer, as she needed the work. She didn't know the state of her house yet, but Will lived on Diamond, and he'd said he'd be going by this afternoon to get some pictures for her. Her blood buzzed in her veins, and she looked up from her phone. She couldn't say met a man to her teenagers. Alice had no idea how to do this, and worse, she didn't have anyone she could ask. Robin was happily married, and Eloise didn't have children she had to tell about her new possible boyfriend. "Mom?" Ginny asked, always the more serious twin. She worried too much, too, and Alice didn't want to add to that. "I reconnected with someone I knew in high school," Alice said. "He asked me to dinner, and She looked away from Ginny to Charlie, who would likely take the news harder. A smile spread across his face slowly, and Alice didn't understand the meaning of it.
You said yes.
Charlie said. Alice nodded. I said yes. We haven't been out yet or anything, she added quickly. With the tsunami, he'll be very busy. He owns the ferry system here in Five Island Cove, and he's got a tremendous amount of work on his plate. She took a breath and squared her shoulders. So I invited him to our dinner here on the last night. Ginny blinked rapidly. Is he coming? He said he would.
Wait a second,
Charlie said.
He owns the ferry system?
He glanced at Ginny, and they clearly knew something she didn't. Alice used to love their twin connection and how they could have entire conversations with one another without saying a word. Right now, she didn't love it all that much. Yes, Alice said cautiously. Why?
His daughter is Tori?
Charlie asked, stopping next to Ginny and folding his arms. He cocked one hip, and that was his aggressive stance. I believe so, Alice said. He hasn't said much about her, obviously. She cleared her throat. I haven't actually seen him yet. We've just been texting or talking on the phone. A slip of embarrassment moved through her that she'd gotten his number from Kelly, who'd run into him on the ferry.
What do you know about him?
Charlie asked, and Alice didn't like it. She turned away from her children and focused on her laptop. I don't have to answer to you, Charlie. I was merely letting you know. I'm single, and I'm not doing anything wrong by going on a date with a man. Of course not, Mom, Ginny said, ever the peacemaker between Alice and Charlie. It's great. I mean, good that you're dating. It's not that. Alice removed her hands from the keyboard and worked very hard not to sigh. Then what is it? She twisted back to the twins, only to find them silently communicating again. Ginny nodded toward Alice, but Charlie shook his head. Tori is a brat, Ginny finally said, the words practically bursting from her. She's a year younger than us, but everyone knows who she is. She's on the drill team as a freshman, and boy, does she make sure everyone knows it. Ginny rolled her eyes. She's always talking about how rich she is and how she can get her dad to buy her anything. Ginny stopped and took a deep breath, her eyes round and wide. She pressed her fingertips together, a nervous tell that Alice hated. Whenever she'd done it as a little girl, Alice had smoothed her hands away from each other and told her she could always confide in Alice. Always. Oh, Alice said. I don't know what to say. She hadn't asked Will a whole lot about his daughter, and she'd suspected he'd be well off because he owned the entire ferry system in Five Island Cove. That didn't happen for free.
Maybe you won't like him,
Charlie said, some measure of hope in his voice. Alice already liked Will, but she didn't want to be quite so explicit with her kids. Maybe, she conceded. I don't know if he's bringing Tori to dinner. He didn't mention it. She's in Hawaii with her mom, Ginny said. Surprise wove through Alice. Oh.
That's right. She said it on the morning announcements at least 40 times,
Charlie said, rolling his eyes. Ginny glared at him. Probably only once or twice, she said, quickly looking back at Alice. I have, something to tell you, too. She sat down on the bed she and Alice had shared last night. There's this boy. Oh, dear, Alice said, though a smile quickened her soul and curved her mouth. Go on. His name is Cameron, Ginny said. He's in my chemistry class, and he's so cute, Mom.
Cameron Heights?
Charlie asked.
No way. No way, Ginny.
He asked me to the spring fling, Ginny said, glaring at Charlie with a stronger edge in her eyes. You don't get any say in who I go out with. Charlie turned to Alice.
Mom, he's a total douche.
Language, Alice said, trying to maintain a balance between the two of them. She knew Ginny sometimes felt left out because Alice spent so much time talking to Charlie one-on-one. He had always needed more attention from Alice, more reassurances, more help with his homework, and more affection. Alice wanted to keep the lines of communication open between her and Charlie, and that took time and energy. On the other hand, Charlie sometimes felt left out because Alice and Ginny both loved girly things. They loved getting pedicures and buying fancy dresses. They loved parties and dances and going shopping together. She looked back and forth between them. "Why is he a douche?" she asked. Charlie sat on the bed next to Ginny.
He goes out with a different girl like every week, Mom.
He reached for Ginny's hand and took it in his.
You know he does, Jen.
"So what?" Ginny asked. "The spring fling isn't until March, and he's already asked me."
Yeah, so he can sleep with you after the dance,
Charlie said, his eyes trained on the floor.
I have PE with him, Jenny. He is not a nice guy.
Ginny looked at Alice, anger and pleading in her expression. Alice wanted to protect her daughter, but she couldn't take Charlie's side straight away. "Maybe you should go out with him at least once or twice before the dance," Alice said, "just to see if you really like him. Men can be cute and not worth your time."
He's not even that cute,
Charlie muttered, and Alice couldn't help the beat of laughter that sprung from her throat. "Mom," Ginny said, tearing her hand away from Charlie's, "I knew you'd take his side." She got up from the bed and stomped toward the door. "I'm going to see if I can get a ride down to the disaster zone and help out for the day." "Ginny," Alice called after her, but her daughter didn't slow or stop. "I have my phone," she said, and with that, she exited the suite, the door practically slamming behind her, she pulled it so hard. Alice sighed then and looked at Charlie. He wore a fierce look of determination on his face.
He's a total and complete douche, Mom. She can't go out with him.
Alice thought of Frank and how she probably should have known what kind of man he was, too. She thought of Eloise's first husband and how everyone but her could see he was no good for her. She thought of Nathan and how AJ had clung to him for years. Yeah, well, every woman has to decide for themselves what they can tolerate and what they can't, she said quietly, her own hands weaving patterns around one another now. "How are things with Mandy? Are you going to take her to the spring fling?"
I haven't even thought about it.
"I guarantee she has." Charlie sighed, clearly irritated by the thought of going to a dance at all. He'd never been into those kinds of high school things.
I guess I'll have to take her.
"You make it sound akin to torture," Alice said with a smile. When he returned it, she swallowed and braced herself for her next question. "You guys aren't having sex, are you?"
Gross, Mom,
Charlie said, standing up.
I'm going to take a shower.
"It's not gross," she called after him. "You still shouldn't be doing it, but it's not gross."
Whatever,
Charlie said before he went into the bathroom and definitely slammed the door behind him. "You didn't answer me satisfactorily," Alice muttered as she picked up her phone. "I would have liked an absolutely not, Mom. I would never do that. I don't even think about having sex with my girlfriend." She sighed because she knew he did. Thinking about it and acting on those thoughts were two totally different things, and Alice tapped to dial back the number that had called before the conversation that had both of her kids walking away from her angry.
Hello.
A cool female voice answered the line. Alice immediately sat up straighter and donned her professional demeanor. "Yes," she said, pleasant. "Hello, I'm returning a call from this number that I missed. This is Alice Kelton." She had not changed her name after the divorce because she wanted the same last name as her children. She'd been married to Frank for almost 20 years. Just because they weren't together anymore didn't mean she couldn't use the name.
Ah, of course. Let me put you through to Ms. Summers.
"Thank you," Alice said, as if she knew who Miss Summers was. Fancy elevator music actually came on the line, and Alice's eyes widened. She quickly navigated to a new document on her laptop, and she'd just typed Miss Summers at the top of it when another female voice said,
Alice Kelton. Thank you for calling me back.
She sounded pleasant enough, and it was so hard to assign age to a voice. Alice estimated her to be middle-aged, at least in her 40s, if not older, though she did have a somewhat high tone that didn't sound too nasally or whiny. "Of course," Alice said. "What can I do for you?"
I run a charitable foundation out of Halifax, she said smoothly. We've seen all the devastation there on the island, and when I searched online for who to contact there, you're one of the first names that comes up.
Alice smiled at that, but she hadn't typed in any notes. "That's great," she said. "But I'm a lawyer, ma'am. I'm not organizing anything charitable."
You're not?
"No, ma'am." She cocked her head to the side. "What makes you think I would be?"
Well, you have a number of fundraisers and other charitable drives attributed to your name,
She said, her words the perfectly round type of someone who'd grown up in the Atlantic Northeast. "Ah, yes, from my time in the Hamptons," she said. "I live full-time in Five Island Cove now. I'm not the PTA president or on the homeowners board of directors." Sometimes Alice missed her old life. She'd get a flash of what her days used to hold, and sometimes it seemed more exciting than working on a laptop in a pitch-black room so her 15-year-old could sleep late.
Of course not,
Miss Summers said with a light, airy laugh that was entirely fake. Alice knew. She'd spent over a decade with false laughs and casual waves of the arm that were meant to mean nothing's important here, when there was always something crucial behind the scenes when one had to lie to keep the conversation going. "I'm not sure how I can help you."
You know quite a few people in the Cove, I'm assuming.
"Yes," Alice said cautiously. "Not as many as Robin or even Eloise, as the chief probably did literally know everyone."
Then you know who needs help. My organization is collecting nominations for the residents of Five Island Cove, and we'll be choosing several people to fund in their restoration or repair, replacement of anything lost, or actual cash restitution if things can't be replaced or repaired.
Alice's mouth dropped open, and she couldn't form a thought, let alone a sentence.
Can I send you an email?
Miss Summers asked.
It'll have all the details in it, along with the nomination form. We want to get started as soon as possible, so if you could look at it and see if there's anyone you would nominate, that would be appreciated.
She paused for a moment, and Alice supposed she should have a question or two. Her mind was still trying to catch up to cash restitution.
You can share the nomination form around the Cove, Miss Summers said. We'll close it when the funds have been used up.
"Okay," Alice said dumbly.
Great.
Miss Summers could breeze through her words like a spring wind coming off the ocean.
I just need that email address.
20 minutes later, Alice's computer notified her of a new email, and she practically lunged for the mouse to navigate to it. Foolishness filled her, because she hadn't gotten Miss Summers' first name, nor the name of the charitable organization, and with every passing minute, she'd felt more and more conned. The email came from a Sasha Summers, account manager at White Sands Worldwide. There was a website and a physical address in Halifax. Alice still wasn't sure, and she clicked on the website, hoping to see a picture of Sasha. She imagined her to have long, straight blonde hair, perfectly smooth skin with the exact right amount of blush. She'd be wearing a dark blue blouse, because dark blue always looked amazing on people with fair features. The website loaded quickly, and it had a security feature in the address. It was populated with recent posts, and it flaunted a professional, clean, crisp design. Every single thing Alice looked at screamed professional and legit, and she started to relax. She clicked around on different tabs, but the About page didn't have pictures. It did have a bio for Sasha, and she'd been at White Sands Worldwide for 20 years, hailed from a small island in the Atlantic harbors, and had previously worked at a nonprofit organization in Massachusetts. She worked to find and carry out projects that needed a white sand touch, and Alice's fears about the organization faded completely. After closing the website, she read the email in its entirety. There was little more information than what she'd gotten on the phone, and Alice wished her mind had been working properly when she'd had Sasha in person. She replied to the email, asking where the funding came from and if any of it needed to be repaid. White Sands Worldwide wasn't a nonprofit organization that Alice had seen on the website, and that meant they made money somehow. She clicked the form to see what it entailed to nominate someone to get the white sand touch, and it was easily the simplest form Alice had ever seen. That raised a red flag, and she left it open to go back to her email. Sasha had responded already.
All grants are privately funded, and we've had someone who's a native of Five Island Cove just pledge 6 figures to help residents there.
She wants them to have a magical Christmas. Smiley face. Smiley face. Alice scoffed and sat back from her computer. She folded her arms as she considered what to do. Her mind flowed in and out like ocean waves, and she could see Robin's face as she began crying over Duke's boat. She could see the broken windows in the house she'd just sold, as well as the trees that had caused the damage. She saw Matt's face as he showed AJ the pictures of the golf course his family owned.
Over 75% of it is still underwater,
He'd said. Kelly had gone down to the beach bungalow, and the water line was up to the ceiling. She didn't own it, but the man who did said he couldn't afford to fix the damage. She and Parker were basically homeless. Eloise had offered her a room here at the inn, but that meant a room she couldn't earn money with. Her mother had a broken leg, and her house had water damage too. Alice could honestly nominate the entire population of people in Five Island Cove. She exhaled and sat back up to the computer. 6 figures, she muttered. How much does a new beach bungalow and a fishing boat cost? As she filled out the form for Duke Grover, then Matthew Hymas, then William Bridge and all of his damaged ferries, Alice suspected there would be a price to pay later for free money now. She couldn't stop herself, though, because she couldn't stand to see her dear friends in so much turmoil. Kristen, Kelly, Robin's mother, and Alice even nominated herself in conjunction with her new buyers to get the house back to the condition it was in when they'd committed to buying it. Charlie came out of the bathroom and said he was going to go find the chief to see what he could do to help out, and Alice barely grunted at him. She was too busy filling out the form. When she finally finished, Alice sat back, her heart actually thumping in an elevated way, as if she'd just done something exhilarating. "Please let this work," she whispered, and she closed her laptop. Her kids were off helping around the island, and Alice should be too.
Chapter 14. Kristen picked through the soggy clothing in what had been her closet. She wore rubber gloves, but a tremor of disgust still squirreled through her. "There's nothing here worth saving," she said to herself. Reuben and Jean had been helping her salvage anything Kristen identified, but they'd gone inland to volunteer there. The ferry system had opened up earlier that morning, and Kristen had been texting with her girls. They were all okay, thankfully, and Kristen paused to look up to the ceiling as if she could see all the way to heaven. Unfortunately, the roof did have a hole big enough for her to see the sky through it, and she stilled completely. She didn't want to be here. She'd been sleeping at Reuben's for the past 2 nights, and she didn't want to be there for a third. She got along great with Reuben and Jean. That wasn't the problem. The problem was this tiny cottage on this slab of rock didn't feel like home anymore. Joel was gone, and while he'd become a different man in her mind than the one she'd believed him to be in person, she still saw him everywhere she looked out here at the lighthouse. Perhaps it was time for her to find a new spot of earth to call hers. The water had swept her car up and over the rocks and down the hill, though Reuben had taken it, along with his, to the garage at the entrance to the parking lot. He'd found both of them and gotten them back to their proper places. The sun had been shining all day, but it was a weak winter sun that brought light but not much heat. The interior would still be wet. The rideshare system was completely overrun, as a lot of people were in the same situation as she was. Their cars were in some state of disrepair. Her phone rang, and she knew who it would be. Robin. Out of all the girls, she'd noticed that Kristen had not given a status update on her house and belongings. She'd only checked in to let everyone know she was alive and well, that Reuben and Jean were doing great, and that the hurricane that had been named a couple of days ago had turned and would not be hitting Five Island Cove. Most hurricanes didn't form this far north anyway, especially in the winter, and Kristen wasn't surprised by that. What she was surprised by was her unemotional attachment to this place she'd called home for so many years. She gazed around, looking at the path she'd trod so many times. She knew the way by the feel of the rocks beneath her feet, and she loved standing at the edge of the cliffs and looking out over the water. To her knowledge, there wasn't anything out in the ocean between this side of Diamond Island and Europe, thousands and thousands of miles away. That amount of water boggled her mind, and she didn't try to hold it there the way she had at other times of her life. She'd accepted her place inside the vastness of this universe, and she'd made a good life for herself here. She could do it again. A house was just a house. Cars were just cars. They didn't hold any sway over her, and she could fill a new place with fresh photos, new memories, and loud laughter. The phone stopped ringing, and Kristen regretted getting so deep inside her head that she'd missed Robin's call. The woman genuinely cared about her as fiercely as a daughter loved their mother, and Kristen lifted her phone to call her back. Her phone rang again, and Robin's name sat there again. Kristen swiped on the call and said, "Hello, dear."
"There you are,"
Robin said, half frustrated and half relieved. "How are things going over there?" Kristen looked around the bedroom and turned toward the exit. "Just fine," she said. "Reuben and Jean are off volunteering, and I'm going through the house."
"You haven't said anything about your house."
"It's got some holes in it," she said. "I've decided to leave it all behind. I'm going to be looking for somewhere else to live."
"My goodness,"
Robin said, her shock palpable even through the line.
"Where are you going to go?"
"I don't know," Kristen said, realizing how that sounded. "I'm not leaving the cove, Robin."
"Oh, thank heaven,"
Robin said with a sigh.
"You scared me there for a minute, Kristen."
She laughed lightly, and Kristen could hear the anxiety in her tone. "Duke's boat is lost, isn't it?" Kristen asked.
"Yes,"
Robin said.
"No one has a boat right now. It's okay."
She took a big breath.
"We're going to be okay."
"Yes," Kristen said, reaching the door and exiting the cottage where she'd lived for the past several years. "Things do tend to work out in the end."
"Sometimes that road is long and riddled with potholes, though,"
Robin said.
"I don't know, Kristen. It feels like every time Duke and I are making some good headway on our bills and debts, something happens to derail us completely."
"I know, dear."
"I'm not going to complain about this,"
Robin said.
"Sorry, Kristen."
"You don't need to apologize to me."
"Will you please come to the inn? It's dry here and everyone's gone now. There's a room on the bottom floor for you, and I need you here."
"I'm going to come right now," Kristen said, deciding on the spot. "You can help me look for a new place here on Diamond."
"Yes,"
Robin said.
"that sounds great."
Kristen tilted her head toward the uprise of rocks that hid the rest of the island from view. The wind blew, but the wind always came to play at the lighthouse, and Kristen was accustomed to it. In fact, if the wind didn't bluster and blow around the tall, white lighthouse, Kristen would think there was a problem. "Why do you need me there, dear?" she asked.
"Duke couldn't come, obviously," Robin said, "though I think he is going to come tomorrow. Our house is slightly wet, and he's working on it with a neighbor today. Anyway,"
she cleared her throat.
"promise you won't say anything to the others?"
"Always," Kristen said.
AJ is pregnant and just so happily in love with Matt. It's great. It is. It's just so different than my life. Alice has Will she's texting with every 5 seconds. Eloise and Aaron are busy around the island, and they have each other. Kelly is someone else, Kristen. You won't even recognize her. I feel like I don't fit."
"Ridiculous," Kristen wanted to say. Robin was the glue that held them all together. She fit because she created the container they all existed in. "Of course you fit," Kristen said. "I'm sure it feels like you don't, though. Can we back up to AJ is pregnant?" Robin told her the story of how they'd been told, and she related an up-and-down version of AJ that Kristen recognized from her teens.
"So she's off her meds, and wow, you can tell."
"That's not good," Kristen said. She's going to need a lot of help over the next few months.
She's moving here, Robin said. So she'll be around. She's moving in with Matt.
Oh, so she'll be on Diamond too.
With me, you, and Alice, Robin said.
And that seemed to perk her up.
Please let me know when you get on the ferry. I worry about you.
I know you do. Are they doing rideshare over there?
No, Robin said. If you text me when you get on the ferry, I'll come down and get you.
Robin.
Don't say no. There's no rideshare. I'm going to be your rideshare.
Kristen knew better than to argue with the woman when she spoke in that voice. Okay, she said.
Great, Robin giggled. I'll get a few things done for this new bride, and I'll be at the station when you come in.
The call ended, and Kristen gave herself a few moments to stand still on the sidewalk down from her house. She looked right, and the lighthouse loomed before her. She'd had a great life here, a really amazing life. It was simply time to move on. And Kristen turned left, where the full possibilities of Diamond Island waited for her.
No, that's the bottom piece,
Alice said the following morning. The moment Kristen had stepped inside the Cliffside Inn, she'd instantly felt at home. The way Alice had rushed at her and held her tightly had helped, as had the vibrant and noisy dinner they'd shared last night. It reminded her of the parties at Alice's over the summer, and Kristen loved the atmosphere of friendship and acceptance she felt with her seafaring girls. This morning they'd eaten cold cereal and fruit, and then Eloise had brought out the fake Christmas tree. She and Aaron and the girls had removed all the pieces, and now they were working on getting the different segments to come together properly.
She's right,
Billy said, and Kristen did like having the children around. She and Joel had had 2 children, but it had been a very long time since she'd had little children or even teenagers in her life. They switched out the wrong piece for the right one, and Alice started opening boxes of decorations. Kristen joined in then, such a family-oriented atmosphere hanging around them all. Eloise had somehow put holiday music through the speakers at the inn, and Kristen hung a couple of ornaments in the traditional red and green colors, and then retreated to the steps, where she'd set her coffee. She sipped and watched Alice's twins speak to each other as they passed on their way to and from the tree. Robin laughed with AJ about something, and Kristen smiled at the two of them. They both probably felt like they didn't belong here, but they'd both be wrong. AJ seemed so happy, and she definitely possessed a pregnancy glow, though Matt wasn't around this morning. His parents owned a golf course, and they had a lot of work to do there. "Why didn't someone come wake me up?" Kelly asked as she came down the steps. "I'm missing the tree decorating." "You were so tired," AJ said, turning from Robin. "You've been through a lot lately, and we wanted you to get the rest you needed." Kelly accepted her hug, and she settled next to Kristen. She wore a pair of black sweatpants and a bulky sweatshirt with colored butterflies all over it. "It's looking good." "There's plenty of ornaments," Kristen said, nodding toward the boxes. "Go hang one." "I really just need some of that coffee," Kelly said, and she still looked tired. "It's good," Kristen said. "Aaron made it, and he's a master. I'll come with you. You caffeinate up, because I've heard you have an amazing story about the night of the tsunami." She grinned at Kelly, glad when the other woman let a small smile touch her mouth. "It's not that amazing," Kelly said as she stepped through the fray of people decorating the Christmas tree in the foyer at the Cliffside Inn. The colored lights would be a welcome addition to all the polished wood and fresh-faced walls. Kristen thought Eloise had done a superb job of fixing up the inn and making it feel modern yet quaint at the same time. Alice mentioned breaking and entering, Kristen said, following Kelly. Kelly laughed, and that definitely wasn't a denial. "Aaron needed gas," she said. "I had to go into the convenience store and get the gas can." "Of course," Kristen said as Kelly went into the kitchen. Kelly did seem different. She was more confident and more articulate. 8 months ago, when she'd come for Joel's funeral, Her own shadow had startled her, and Kristen was just so glad to see her acting more like the person she'd been suppressing for so long. "Is Julian coming?" Kristen asked, and Kelly's movement in putting the coffee pot back on the burner stuttered. Oh, there was something going on there, and Kristen lifted her coffee mug. Never mind. "He's not coming," Kelly said, sighing. She stirred sugar and coconut-flavored cream into her coffee. "I haven't told anyone yet. I suppose I should." "If you'd like," Kristen said, hoping she sounded nonchalant. "I'm fine with whatever you want to share." Kelly's eyes met hers, and Kristen gave her a smile. "I love you, Kristen," Kelly said, suddenly pulling her into a hug. "You've been so good to me over the years, and you've always seen this gold inside of me I didn't know I had." Kristen hugged her back, holding her tight as she tried to tame her emotions. She'd just given her one of the best compliments of her life, and Kristen loved her dearly, too. Kelly stepped back and lifted her coffee to her lips. "How's your mother?" Kristen asked. "Is she a safe topic?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face again, and Kelly nodded. "Yes, my mother is a safe topic." "Is she still dating Devin?" "Yes," Kelly said. "They seem very happy together. They're coming, I think. That was the plan, at least. They're coming to the dinner on our last night here." "It seems everyone has invited someone to that," Kristen said. She hadn't, but she painted over the fact that she didn't really have anyone to invite to it with another quick smile. With any luck, no one would notice how melancholy she felt that day, and she'd be able to shake the feeling by lunchtime. Chapter 15. Kelly slid one grilled cheese sandwich onto a plate and then removed a second from the griddle, too. "There's 6 more sandwiches," she said, and several people turned toward her. They all seemed in good spirits, and Kelly smiled at them. She and Robin had been making sandwiches and heating soup in stages, as many as the griddle in Eloise's huge, gorgeous kitchen at the inn would hold. They'd fed the kids first, and Kelly inhaled the scent of warm butter as Robin placed 6 more fully assembled sandwiches on the griddle. They'd been buttering and slicing for several minutes now, and Kelly started pushing plates toward Laurel and Paul, Alice and Kristen, Eloise and Aaron. AJ and Matt had disappeared somewhere, and Kelly wouldn't be surprised if they'd gone behind closed doors for a lunchtime pick-me-up. It wouldn't be the first time AJ had skipped a meal in favor of sleeping with a boy. Kelly honestly didn't know how she had the stamina. "We miss you at lunch," Robin said, taking the spatula from Kelly. She turned her attention from Eloise and Aaron, who seemed so happy together, to Robin. "I know," she said. "I wish I could come." She swallowed back the jealousy that Robin, Eloise, Alice, and Kristen got together every Wednesday. If AJ returned to the Cove full-time, and it sounded like she would, she'd probably join them. That would only leave Kelly out of everyone, and she already struggled to believe she belonged to this group of women. That's not true, she told herself sternly. She did belong in this group, and everyone here loved her as much as she loved them. The mind had a special way of bringing doubt into one's life, and Kelly hated that she even thought for a second that her friends didn't want her there. Robin nudged a sandwich up and then back down, her patience endless. Since her daughters had become teenagers, Robin had perfected the awkward silence where she waited for someone to fill it. "You can come next week," she said. "You'll still be on the holiday break, right?" "Right," Kelly said with a smile. She turned toward the stove to stir the soup, which Robin had poured out of a couple of boxes. She did love roasted red pepper and tomato soup, especially with croutons and sour cream, and she ladled herself a bowl, put in the toppings, and turned back to the counter. Alice and Kristen stood there, and Kelly blinked at them. "I have to tell everyone something," Kristen said. Robin jerked her attention up from the browning sandwiches. "Tell all?" "No," Alice said, and she rolled her eyes at Robin.
You and the tell-all. I like it, Robin said. Surely everyone has something to tell. AJ's not even here, she said. She already said her news anyway, Robin said, glancing at Kelly. Kelly took a deep breath because she was done being the timid woman who let life happen to her. She'd driven a van around in the dark, delivering people to safety in the hours leading up to the tsunami. She could tell her friends about Julian. I have something, she said. I think we should do a tell-all. Traitor, Alice said with a smile. Think of something, Alice, Robin said as she giggled. These sandwiches are almost done. She flipped them one by one, and Kelly took her soup bowl over to the counter where everyone had gathered to eat. We're doing a tell-all, Kelly said to the two couples. Laurel Baker looked up, clear surprise in her eyes. What is that? It's where you have to tell everything, Eloise said. You don't have to. If you stay, you have to tell all, Alice said, taking the bar stool she'd been on a few minutes ago. I'll understand if you want to leave. She wore a hint of displeasure in her eyes, but it was clear she didn't really dislike the tell-all. She'd called them plenty of times in her life, that was for sure. Laurel looked at her boyfriend, Paul, and he got up a moment later. I think I'm out. I'm 100% out, Aaron said, grinning as he leaned over and pressed a kiss to Eloise's forehead. I'll go find the kids, and we'll head back down to the grocery store. Okay, she said, and she smiled as the two men left the kitchen through the door that led straight onto the back patio. Kelly took Aaron's spot next to Eloise, who asked, What am I going to say? Everyone knows everything. Think fast, Kelly said, glancing over to where Robin still nudged the sandwiches around as if that might help them cook faster. No one wanted a soggy sandwich or one that wasn't browned enough. At least Kelly didn't. Kristen returned to the counter with a bowl of soup, and only a second later, Robin called that the sandwiches were done. She turned off the griddle and brought over a sandwich for Kelly and herself and sat in front of the bowl of soup Kristen had brought over. Okay, Kristen wants to go first, she said. Kristen gave Robin a glare, though she had said she had something to say. First, let's clue poor Laurel in to what this is, Eloise said, smiling at the woman. Kelly glanced at her too, and she almost wished she wasn't there. Kelly didn't know Laurel Baker all that well, though she worked with Aaron and she'd helped track down all the information on Kelly's supposed half-brother a few months ago. Laurel had mousy brown hair that she tucked behind her ear. It was thin, like Kelly's, and her brown eyes saw everything, though they possessed kindness, too. It can be anything, Alice said. It's usually not, though, Eloise said. It's usually something that's scary to us, or that we're worried about, or just a really big piece of news. I'll say mine, and she'll understand. Kristen reached over and patted Laurel's hand. My cottage is a soggy, wet mess. The roof has holes in it, and there's nothing I want there. I've decided to leave the lighthouse and find a small house or condo on Diamond Island. Kelly stared at Kristen, disbelieving what she'd just heard. Her mouth dropped open, and she kept stirring her soup with one hand as if it had a mind of its own. Kristen, Alice said. Really? Yes, Kristen said with a nod around to everyone. It's time. Reuben and Jean are happy at the lighthouse, and I can walk away from it now. Kelly didn't think she'd ever hear Kristen say those words, because she'd lived in the lighthouse for decades, then in that cottage behind it. Her whole life had been wrapped up in the lighthouse, and it was her past, present, and future. That's huge, Eloise said. How are you feeling about it? Good, Kristen said. My father always said it would take an act of God to get us off that land, and I guess he was right. She grinned then and picked up her half-eaten sandwich. Well, Reuben's still there, Robin said. Your family is still on that land. Very true. Kristen took a bite of her sandwich and shrugged, clearly saying, That's my news. Who's next? Kelly hadn't taken a bite of her lunch yet.
and she figured she might as well get the words out of her stomach so she could enjoy her food.
So it's news a lot like,
Alice started to say. Julian and I are getting divorced, Kelly interrupted. He moved back to Newark a few weeks ago. Last month, I don't know. She looked down into the swirling, pale redness of her soup. He couldn't run the business from here, but that's not the only reason he went back. No one said anything, and Kelly could have probably stopped there. Instead, she said, "He begged me to come with him, but nothing's changed." She looked up and right into the eyes of her best friends. She wasn't anywhere near close to crying, and that alone was a testament to how much she'd changed. He still wants me and Tiffany, and she's living in his townhome in New Jersey. I asked him to file for divorce since I don't live in Jersey anymore, and he said he would. She nodded and pressed her teeth together.
Kelly,
Alice said.
You shouldn't let him file for divorce.
Why not?
As the defendant, you automatically bear the burden of being labeled the guilty one, whether you are or not.
Kelly's chest squeezed, and she realized she should have gone to Alice first. If I file, I have to pay the fee, she said, because she might as well admit to everything while she was at it. And I have to appear in court. I don't live there. What she was really saying was that it wasn't free to fly to Newark and back. She didn't have anyone to watch Parker, and she had a job 5 days a week. As she gazed around at the other women in the room, she realized she had plenty of people to watch Parker.
Has he filed yet?
That's not how the tell-all works, Robin said. Alice shot her a look that said,
Are you kidding me right now? We said something after Kristen revealed. This is important.
Fine, Robin said. This just doesn't feel like a tell-all, that's all I'm saying. No, he hasn't filed, Kelly said. At least not that I know of.
I'll help you with it,
Alice said.
I really don't think you should let him file.
Okay, Kelly said, finally lifting her soup spoon to her lips. The soup was still hot, tangy, and delicious. Duke's boat is a total loss, Robin said. We have nothing as far as that goes. She took a crispy bite of her sandwich, obviously done talking.
Feels short,
Alice said dryly. Nothing else to say, Robin said around a mouthful of cheese and bread. I don't have much, Eloise said, other than I'm worried I'll never get my mother up to the inn now. Kelly smiled at her as warmly as she could. Dawn Hall was a very routine person, and her experiences shaped her opinions and habits about certain things. It had taken Kelly and Aaron an extraordinary amount of talking and convincing to get her to go to the clinic for her leg because of an experience from decades ago. Getting in an accident on the way up to the inn would definitely leave a scar on her memories.
She's here now,
Alice said.
She'll be okay.
Eloise nodded, and everyone looked at Alice. Kelly would be surprised if they forced Laurel to say anything, but knowing Robin, the cop would have to come up with something. I became a cop on a dare, Laurel said, looking around at everyone with wide, round eyes. She almost looked like she'd been fed to the lions, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Then I liked it so much, I've moved up and become a detective.
That's great,
Alice said with a genuine smile.
You and Paul seem... You don't have to say anything about Paul,
Robin said.
Alice, she said something. I'm just saying,
Alice said.
You police me to death, Robin. You really don't have to be in control of everything.
Kelly burst out laughing, and she was the only one for a few seconds. Eloise finally joined in, and then Kristen, and even Laurel. Finally, Robin's stoic exterior broke, and she dropped her eyes back to her plate. She didn't speak, though, and Alice only smiled. Sorry, Kelly said. Sometimes listening to you two snipe at each other is really funny. It really is, Eloise said, still giggling. Though I do agree with Alice. She wasn't doing anything wrong, Robin.
I know,
Robin said, keeping her gaze down.
I apologize, Alice.
Me too, Alice said, and Kelly had learned from her long ago that she could be right about something and not have to say it. She'd seen Alice do that so many times in their math class growing up. Alice had been terribly smart with numbers, and she'd sit quietly while Roger Bushman went off about something or other that was completely wrong.
"I'm up,"
Alice said.
"I had a woman call me yesterday. She's from a company called White Sands Worldwide, and they're a charitable organization with a native of Five Island Cove who wants to donate money to the people here who've been impacted by the tsunami. I submitted all of us."
She gazed around at everyone, her chin raising an inch or so, almost daring someone to say she shouldn't have.
"I gave them Robin and Duke's name and said they lost his fishing boat. I told them about Kelly's house and Matt's golf course. I submitted Will's name because he needs help with the ferry system, and my name with my buyers, as my house on Rocky Ridge has some damage. I put in your mom's name, Robin, because her house is a wreck, and yours, Kristen, because I assumed you'd need something at the lighthouse, what with it being right on the East Coast cliffs and all."
She cleared her throat and looked at Eloise and Laurel.
"She said they just want to make some Christmas wishes come true. They might not even pick any of us."
Silence draped over the kitchen, only to be broken by Robin's sob and the scraping of her bar stool as she got up and engulfed Alice in a tight hug. Tears came to Kelly's eyes, and she said, "We could use a Christmas miracle." "We sure could," Eloise said, reaching for Kelly's hand. She squeezed, and they smiled at each other. Everyone got up then, surrounded Alice, and started firing off questions to find out more details about this charitable organization and how soon they'd find out who would get their Christmas miracle. Chapter 16. Robin heard her phone buzzing on the nightstand next to her bed, but her brain couldn't seem to force her body to do anything about it. It fuzzed and blurred, and she rolled over, a groan coming from her mouth. She wasn't sure how much time passed before someone touched her shoulder, and Mandy said, "Mom, Dad's freaking out and wants you to call him." That woke Robin, and she sat straight up, nearly knocking into Mandy, who'd bent over her. "Freaking out? About what? What did he say?" Mandy fell back a couple of steps, her eyes widening. Robin couldn't believe she'd slept late enough to have the sun shining through the slatted blinds, illuminating her daughter's face. "I don't know. He called, and he sounded frustrated that you wouldn't answer your phone. I told him you were up late with your friends, and he said to wake you up." She looked disgruntled, like Robin and Duke had interrupted something important she'd been doing. Probably kissing Charlie, Robin thought, surprised her mind had room for such a thing. Duke never freaked out. He hardly ever got frustrated with her at all, and she reached for her phone. "Thanks," Robin said. "What are you and Jamie doing?" "Laurel's showing us how to do self-defense," she said. "I probably missed the elbow throw." She grinned, and before Robin could process that and look at her phone and think about what could possibly have Duke in a tizzy, her daughter was gone. Duke had called a couple of times, and she had multiple texts from him. "Robin, I need to talk to you. I just got a phone call from someone, and they said we've been selected for a grant to replace my fishing boat. Robin, can you pick up? I'm calling Mandy." Her heart beat faster and faster as the words from his second text settled into her mind. They'd been selected. Their Christmas miracle was going to come true. A sob started low in her belly, but she swallowed against it. She'd cried too much in the past several days, and she was done with that. She didn't know how else to deal with the endless pit of worry in her stomach, and it had accompanied her since her husband's birthday, when he'd come home and said the Lady Hawk had been damaged. With the tsunami, he'd said she was gone. The worry inside Robin didn't cease as she tapped to return his calls. She'd know within one word whether this was good news or bad, though a corner of her mind wondered how getting a replacement fishing boat for free could be bad. "Robin," Duke said, his voice full of excitement, and her constant companion of anxiety and worry eased a little bit. They didn't completely go away, and Robin wasn't sure they ever did. They seemed to wait in the wings, ready to pounce at any sentence anyone said or anything Robin ever read. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't go to bed until late, and I've been so stressed." "One less thing to be stressed about," he said, laughing.
I just got a call from a man named Gene Yardley, and he said we were nominated for a grant from this place called White Sands Worldwide, and they're helping people to recover from the tsunami. And they chose us.
He laughed in his deep voice, the one that always brought a smile to Robin's face. His laugh always made her want to laugh too, and she joined in with him the way she often had. The pesky tears came again, but they didn't slip down her face. "What else did they say?" she asked.
He said they'd be sending me an email with all the details, and then someone would literally be on the island this afternoon to meet with me.
"Wow," Robin said, her head starting to spin. She glanced at the clock, in complete shock that she'd slept until 9:15. She was the type who got up at 5:30 every morning to get things done before her family woke up.
I'm headed to the ferry right now,
He said,
so I'll be there in about an hour. We'll do that gift exchange you told me about and go to lunch, and then could you come back to Diamond with me this afternoon? I want you there with me to meet with him.
"Of course," Robin said, standing up. She'd completely forgotten about the gift exchange, not to mention lunch. Duke had originally planned to spend the whole day at the inn with his family, spend the night, and they'd all go home in a couple of days. On Wednesday, which was Christmas Eve. Eloise's first guests were set to arrive that afternoon, and Robin couldn't believe the few days they'd planned to spend at the inn for the holidays were flying by so quickly. Ruined, she thought, a level of bitterness in mind and body that she didn't understand. She saw her friends a lot now, and she looked forward to Wednesdays with a fervor she embraced. There was supposed to be something special about Christmas, though, and Robin hadn't felt it yet. They'd spent yesterday putting the inn back together after pulling it apart to make room for whoever showed up at the door. Those that didn't do that had gone down the cliffs to help the stores, businesses, and private citizens who needed it.
Great.
Duke said.
I'll see you soon. I'm so excited. I hope that email comes really fast.
Me too, she said. Call me if you get it before you get here.
I will.
The wind blew across the microphone on his phone, and Robin knew she needed to let him go. I love you, she said.
This is going to be exactly what we need,
he said.
I love you too, Robin.
The call ended, and Robin quickly got in the shower, got dressed, and got on her computer. She had a wedding in 6 days, and there were at least 100 details that needed to be done before then. She answered the emails from the coordinator at the venue, all of them modifications due to the storm. Her bride would have to deal with it, because decorations, backdrops, and docks had been damaged. After downloading the pictures Judy had sent, she sent them along to her bride, who confirmed that whatever they could do would be just fine. We're just so glad we have somewhere beautiful to be married. Thank you, Robin. Robin smiled at the gratitude coming through in the text, and she moved on to the next thing. Gina had called from the florist shop, and Robin returned her call. Her worry needled through her as Gina started talking, and it took a moment for Robin to realize what she was saying. So nothing's changing? Robin finally asked. No, Gina said. We're on schedule, and we'll be at Victoria's Wharf at 11:30 on Sunday. Amazing, Robin said. Thank you so much, Gina. I'm meeting with Callie after the new year, and I'll need to come sit down with you then. She's texted me again that she wants flowers literally everywhere. Her budget just for flowers is $8,000. Gina whistled, and Robin heard her physically flipping a page. She still used a paper planner for everything, and Robin enjoyed the quirks of her personality. Let's set something up right now, she said. For an order like that, I won't want to miss anything. Okay. Robin clicked over to her online calendar. She color-coded every bride, and she could easily see Callie Lyman's appointments, as they were lime green. I'm meeting with her on the 3rd. The wedding is on May 5th, so we'll have 4 months. I could at 2 o'clock on the 4th, Gina said. Or not until the 7th, but that would be an 8 a.m. appointment, and I know you like those mornings. Robin did. She liked getting up early and getting a lot done by lunchtime. Then she'd stop working on weddings and focus on home and family. She only wanted to work part-time, but the weddings could take over her whole life if she let them. Let's do the 7th, she said. A 2 o'clock meeting meant she wouldn't be home when the girls got out of school, and though Mandy had said she'd keep an eye on Jamie and the mean girls, Robin wanted to be there when Jamie walked in the door.
She moved on to the food for her upcoming wedding, then the digital invitation proofs, which had come in last night. She forwarded all of that to her bride, texted her to say she had, and closed her laptop. Her stomach roared at her about eating, and Robin felt like she was missing out on something happening at the inn. If there was anything Robin hated more than the constant worry running through her veins, it was missing out on something her friends or family were doing. Downstairs, she found AJ and Matt sitting with Eloise and Aaron at one of the tables that had been repositioned in its proper spot in the dining room. They had empty bowls and plates in front of them, an indication that there had been food at some point.
"There you are,"
AJ said, rising to her feet. She wasn't showing at all, but Robin couldn't help sweeping her eyes down the length of AJ's body to check.
"I was about to sick Alice on you."
She grinned at Robin, who smiled back. "I'm tired," she said. "I didn't sleep hardly at all on Saturday night."
"I don't think any of us did."
"I also didn't sneak away at lunchtime yesterday to nap." Robin raised her eyebrows at AJ as they went into the kitchen, and AJ laughed.
"It was a great nap,"
she said. She moved over to the sink and put the dishes down inside it.
"There's oatmeal and cold cereal. Matt wanted to make blueberry pancakes, but Eloise said those are for tomorrow."
"I won't be late tomorrow morning then," Robin said, reaching for a bowl. She and dairy didn't get along very well, so she opted for a scoop of oatmeal without any of the honey and sugar sitting there. A shriek filled the air, and Robin spun toward the back door to see Kelly standing there. She held up her phone, her face bearing a load of excitement that had Robin's pulse thumping.
"I just got a call from Marian Usher. She said I've been selected for a grant to get me into a new house here in the Cove."
"You're kidding," AJ said, already moving toward her. The two of them embraced and laughed together. The pair ended up jumping up and down like giddy teenagers, and Robin finally thawed from where the news had frozen her to the floor. She hugged Kelly too and said, "Duke got a call too. They're going to replace his boat."
"This is so amazing,"
Kelly said, gushing now over everything Marian had said. She finally exhaled, her chest rising and falling so fast.
"She said someone will meet me on Diamond Island at some point this afternoon."
She looked back and forth between Robin and AJ.
"Do you think it's okay that I go?"
"Of course," AJ said. "I'm going with Duke," Robin said. "This is huge, Kelly. We'll do the gift exchange and go." A rush of trepidation moved through her at the thought of seeing what state her house was in. Duke had sent pictures, but seeing things in person made them more real in a way pictures simply couldn't do. Aaron came into the kitchen, and Robin turned toward him. He looked like he had something to say, and she took a couple of steps toward him. "What is it?" she asked.
Eloise is talking to someone about a grant for her mother's house.
Robin froze again, sure she'd heard him wrong. Aaron hooked his thumb over his shoulder.
And Matt took a call and left for a minute, then came back with a huge smile on his face, saying he had to run out front to call his parents and to let AJ know.
AJ came to Robin's side, and her hand slipped into Robin's.
I guess he talked to someone too, and they're going to fund the restoration of the golf course.
Aaron tilted his head, his eyes burning with curiosity and a smile nowhere in sight.
What's going on? Who's sending all this money to do all of this?
Chapter 17. AJ wasn't sure if the reason her stomach kept cramping was because of the morning sickness, the excitement flowing through the inn, or Aaron's refusal to see the bright side of everyone getting their Christmas miracle. He wore a perpetual frown as Eloise explained what her caller had told her. Then Forrest said that they'd get my mother's medical records and make sure she didn't have a massive medical bill either. She wore excitement in her dark eyes, making them shine like black gold. So, with the water restoration and any sewing machine replacement, I explained that she was a seamstress by trade and needed those machines. She'll be back to new in no time. She seemed so happy, and AJ reached over and squeezed her hand. Aaron did not. They're sending someone to do an evaluation on the golf course, Matt said. Today. Today! I just can't believe it. They don't waste any time. He looked around at the group, and a rush of gratitude for the accepting nature of her friends filled AJ. They'd assimilated him into their group without question, with a smile and open arms, simply because he was important to AJ. She was important to them. Robin had already told everyone what she knew about Duke's conversation with yet a different person from White Sands Worldwide. AJ didn't care how many people they employed or how many came to Diamond Island. She wanted everyone to get what they needed to move their lives back toward normal. They all sat around a couple of tables they'd pushed together in the dining room, and once Matt stopped talking, silence fell over them. Then Kristen's phone rang on the table in front of her. Every eye flew toward it, and she leaned in.
I don't know the number.
Answer it,
Alice said.
I submitted your name too.
She gripped her phone like it alone would keep her sane. She'd put in her name, along with her buyer's, and she hadn't gotten a call yet. Kristen swiped and tapped to put the phone on speaker.
Hello?
Yes, hello, a round, crisp female voice said. This is Tanya Sharpino from White Sands Worldwide. Am I speaking with Kristen Shields? A roar from the group rose up, and AJ started laughing. Out of all of them, only Aaron looked like he didn't like what was happening. Everyone else looked as if someone had shown up with stunning pellets and they'd all been hit multiple times. Kristen raised her hand, and that got people to quiet down. Yes, she said. This is Kristen Shields. Tanya laughed, but it was still clearly professional. I can see you're with friends. Yes, Kristen said, pure sunshine pouring from her expression now. AJ's heart expanded 10 sizes. Perhaps Kristen wouldn't have to leave her generational land on the edge of the cliffs, next to the lighthouse she loved so much. I'm happy to say that you were nominated for some help from our charitable foundation, and we've selected you to receive some funds to help you get back on your feet following the tsunami. Kristen pressed one hand to her chest, though she had to be expecting Tanya to say exactly what she had. Robin giggled and squeezed Eloise's hand on one side and Laurel's on the other. AJ let her eyes linger on the second woman, who'd somehow integrated herself into their small group fairly easily. AJ wondered how she did that. AJ had never been able to integrate herself into any groups without consistent, persistent effort, and sometimes she still felt like an outsider in a lot of ways. Alice sat back, pure disbelief on her face. Her eyes started to fire a lot the way Aaron's were, and when they looked at each other, AJ could tell they were having a silent conversation she didn't understand. Some of her enthusiasm faded, though, because she couldn't see why they should be concerned about this. Alice herself had told them about White Sands Worldwide. She'd submitted all of their names. Why had she done that if she was worried about something? Tanya finished telling Kristen about how they'd send someone to Diamond Island that afternoon, same as everyone else, and that they'd go to Kristen's home to assess the damage. Things will move from there, Tanya said. You have somewhere safe to stay in the meantime? We can put you in a hotel. I have somewhere to stay, Kristen said, and before her call ended, Alice's phone rang. She jumped to her feet, looking at her phone as if it had transformed into a poisonous snake and might strike her right at the jugular at any moment. Oh, my word, she breathed just before she strode out of the room. As she took the steps up into the lobby, she lifted her phone to her ear. AJ met Kelly's eyes, and they got up together. She wanted to know who was on the phone with Alice, and she'd eavesdrop if she had to. Alice paced in the foyer, her eyes unhappy and her eyebrows drawn down. Yes, I understand, she said, glancing at Kelly and AJ. What I'm asking is where the money is coming from. She shook her head and spun on her heel again, her shoulder-length brown hair swinging with the movement. Everything about Alice had stayed neat and trim, despite the past several months of turmoil in her life. AJ hugged herself as Alice said, I want to know who the benefactor is. I want to know the terms of this donation before I agree to anything. She paused near the check-in podium and kept her back to Kelly and AJ. A seething sensation started in AJ's stomach, and she moved one hand there to press against the nerves. She did feel somewhat sick again, and she wasn't even sure why. "She's worried," Kelly said. "Do you know why?" "No," AJ murmured, most of her joy diffusing now that Alice, one of the smartest women AJ knew, wasn't hopping around with a giant grin on her face. Perhaps Erin's concern was valid. She turned back to the dining room and walked away from Alice just as she started to say,
"No, that's not okay. I need—"
AJ would get caught up with everything she suspected or was worried about once she got off the phone. "Matt," she said, touching his shoulder. He turned away from the group and looked up at her, his smile wide and beautiful. "Hey." He stood and took her into his arms. "Can you believe this? It really is going to be okay." Enveloped in this new energy, AJ wasn't sure why she'd been tense only 10 seconds ago. She gripped the feeling and stepped back slightly. "What did... who called you from White Sands?" "A woman named Sasha," he said. That name rang a bell, and AJ tilted her head. "I think that's the same woman Alice talked to a day or two ago, the one who told her about their charity." AJ found herself needing a lot more information. She was a sports reporter, and she knew how to dig to get information. "I'm going to get my laptop," she said. "Then I want to know every word that woman said to you on the phone." She realized that several others were looking at her too. She gazed around at Eloise, Robin, Laurel, Kristen, and the others. She wanted all of their stories too, every name. "I want to talk to everyone too," she said. "I just need to get my computer. Then I want all the details." "Finally," Aaron said, almost under his breath. AJ nodded and started back toward the foyer.
"What is she looking for?" Robin asked. "They're a charitable organization. They help people."
Other voices spoke, but AJ had long legs, and she'd ate up the distance back to Kelly already. She expected to see her best friend hugging herself, eyes wide, as she continued to listen to Alice. Instead, Kelly stood with one hip cocked, a frown on her delicate features as Alice said,
"Well, I'll meet you there, but I want full details. I want to see a contract. I want to know what I'm signing away and to whom before a single dime is spent on me."
She turned and faced AJ and Kelly.
"That goes for everyone,"
she added.
"I'm not going to let anyone take advantage of my friends."
AJ felt her passion and determination, and it dove through her too. The last thing she wanted was to see anyone in this inn get hurt in any way. She hurried past the podium while Alice continued to listen to whoever had called her. She darted into the room she and Matt had been assigned and grabbed her computer. Back in the lobby, she caught the backs of Kelly and Alice as they returned to the dining room, and AJ hurried to follow them. Her head throbbed, and she felt somewhat unsteady on her feet, but she pressed forward. "Okay," she said, setting the laptop on the table. "One at a time. I want names, what they told you, all of it." AJ sat down and opened a new notes document. She had started a countless number of these, and her fingers knew exactly what to do. "I talked to Tanya Sharpino," Kristen said. "Forrest Bell called me," Eloise said. "Marion Usher," Kelly said. "Sasha Summers," Matt said, and his eyes were wide now too. AJ wished she could erase the worry in them. She didn't want to cause that.
"I spoke to her originally," Alice said quietly. "Just now I got a call from Carol Grady."
"How many people work there?"
Laurel asked. "Seems like a big group." AJ watched her and Aaron exchange a glance while her fingers flew through typing the names. She'd spent so much of her career on a keyboard that she didn't have to look at her hands to type. "Robin," Eloise prompted.
"I didn't talk to them,"
Robin said.
"I don't know who it was. Duke said, but I didn't think it was important."
She still looked slightly perturbed that they were having this conversation at all.
"Hello?"
A man called, and Robin sucked in a breath, jumped to her feet, and ran toward her husband. She shrieked as she launched herself at him, and he laughed as he caught her around the waist and picked her right up. AJ actually envied the petite woman. AJ would never launch her 6-foot-tall frame at a man, no matter how little she weighed. But Robin was 8 inches shorter than her, and she fit right against Duke's upper half with her legs around his waist. He put her down a moment later, and they both came back into the dining area. "They want to know who you talked to this morning," she said.
"A guy named Gene Yardley,"
Duke said.
"I just got a text from him, too. Diamond Island, Downtown Park Pavilion, 4 o'clock.
As if summoned by the time and place announcement, Matt's phone chimed. AJ glanced at it as he did, and she watched as he swiped it open. He looked up, his eyes even rounder now.
"I just got the same text."
He held up his phone as if people wouldn't believe him. AJ stared at it, quickly typing in the exact wording. She wasn't sure why this was bothering her. Perhaps because it bothered Alice.
"Can we table this for now?"
Eloise asked. "Yes," Robin said, glaring openly at Alice and then AJ. "It's time for the gift exchange. Then we're having a holiday luncheon." "This could be something," AJ said. "No, it's not," Robin argued. "It's a charitable organization helping people after a natural disaster. There are 1,000 companies, churches, and groups like this."
"We did organize as a church and go to Belle Island when they had their beach cleave off into the ocean,"
Kristen mused.
"No strings attached."
"I'm sure everything is fine," Eloise said. But AJ watched Erin gape at her.
"Robin's right. Alice wouldn't have submitted any of our names if she hadn't done her research first anyway."
She turned her gaze to Alice, as did everyone else.
They seemed legitimate.
Alice conceded, her voice much softer than the one she'd used when speaking on the phone only a few minutes ago.
I think we should ask a lot of questions and read the fine print before any of us sign anything.
She surveyed the group, and most people nodded their assent. That made sense to AJ, and she typed in one more note before closing the lid on her laptop. "Gift exchange," she said. "Everyone get your kids, and let's move over to the couches. It'll be more comfortable, and I put the treats over there." She led the way because the gift exchange had been her idea. AJ had always wanted a family tradition of a pre-Christmas gift exchange with her loved ones. For a few years after she'd finally finished college, she'd tried with her brother and sister, but neither Amelia nor Ryan had been too keen on the idea. They'd done what she'd wanted because AJ knew how to get what she wanted. In the end, she'd decided it was too much work to try to make sure the three of them stayed close simply by purchasing a couple of gifts each year. As time went on, she knew that wasn't how relationships were built anyway. They needed constant care, continual nourishment, and unfeigned love to be able to succeed. She thought of her sister out on Pearl Island with their father. Amy was the youngest, and she claimed to simply understand their father in a way AJ did not. She'd been at home with him for 2 years after AJ left for college, and she'd stayed on the island furthest south to raise her family. AJ wondered if Amy was happy. Surely she was. She'd been married to a man named Donovan for 10 years now, and they had 2 little girls AJ had flown home to see when they were both newborns. Her guilt was as sharp as ever as she waited for everyone to settle down and for all the kids to make their way into the lobby area. Once they were all seated, with their gifts on their laps or nearby, AJ picked up the bowl she'd prepared. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to draw a name, and whoever was assigned that person will present their gift." She smiled around at her friends, old and new, taking a moment to enjoy them for who they were. Alice, for her unwavering strength and refusal to compromise on what she thought was right. Robin, for her mothering spirit and the way she could unite all of them so easily. Eloise, for her good heart and kindness to AJ, even if they were cut from opposite sides of a cloth. Kelly, AJ's dear Kelly, who'd never judged her, criticized her, or done anything but support her. Kelly smiled at her, and AJ nearly burst into tears. "Thank you for indulging me with this," AJ said, her voice tight. "I think we should make it a tradition. It certainly seems like we're all going to be living here from now on, and we could take turns hosting each year." She looked around, her hope bright as she took in the men and women present with them. She noticed that Alice and Kelly had settled beside one another, the only two women there without a boyfriend or significant other. AJ knew keenly how that felt, and her heart expanded for her friends.
I'm sure I could do it,
Alice said.
I love a good holiday party.
She grinned too, and somehow that broke the tension that had accompanied them to the gift exchange. Robin agreed, and Eloise said the inn would always be available, though that surely couldn't be true. She'd want the inn to be filled with paying guests, not her friends. Family traditions are important, Laurel said from right next to AJ, and AJ felt a kinship with her she hadn't expected to feel. Okay. AJ drew in a deep breath. Her fingers fumbled over the little slips of paper she'd made. She finally grabbed one and pulled it out. Robin. She put the basket down, because she wouldn't need it again unless the chain moved to someone who'd already given away their gift. Robin grinned and stood up.
I had Grace.
She walked over to the girl who sat on her father's lap, and it was as if the whole world smiled as Robin handed her a box wrapped in bright purple paper.
I didn't know I was going to get a gift.
Grace looked up at Robin with eyes full of wonder.
What do you say?
Aaron asked.
Thank you,
Grace said, finally reaching to take the gift.
I just open it now?
She looked around, some measure of fear in her eyes. Yep, Eloise said, and then you give your gift to your person. She glanced at AJ. Right? AJ nodded, unable to speak. She loved the magic and love that Christmas brought with it, and she was glad she'd volunteered to put together their meals and activities. Really, once she'd sent an outline of the few days they'd be at the inn together, everyone had stepped up and volunteered for things. Kelly would run the family tradition luncheon in a few minutes, and Alice and Kristen had partnered up for the big finale dinner the day before Christmas Eve. Grace opened her gift, and her smile was as wide as the Atlantic Ocean when she pulled out a pair of pink jelly shoes.
I've always wanted a pair of these.
She gazed at them as if they were Dorothy's ruby red slippers.
Thank you, Robin.
She slid from Aaron's lap and went to hug Robin, who embraced her with a warm smile and her eyes pressed closed. AJ reached for Matt's hand because she knew in that moment she was going to be okay. She might not know what she was doing as a mother most of the time, but she could learn. She wanted a little girl like Grace to spoil and love, and she couldn't wait for her baby to be born. The fear and trepidation about being a mother, and if she had the internal fortitude to stick with it when her mother hadn't, disappeared. It wasn't there anymore, and AJ hoped the doubts and darkness would stay away forever. Chapter 18. Laurel clung tightly to Paul's hand, noting that he didn't seem to mind. He even adjusted their hands a couple of times during the gift exchange. She hadn't anticipated being here for this, but they'd been working so hard around Sanctuary Island, and as it was her and her partner's assigned island, it felt like the right place to be. The chief had planned to take this week off already, and he'd been coordinating everything from the Cliffside Inn. Laurel, Paul, Connor, and 3 other cops that had been on Sanctuary when the tsunami warning had come in had been working around the island to get things put back together, and Laurel half wished she'd gone down to the beaches again this morning. She and Paul had lingered to help with breakfast, and she hadn't known how to slip away from this gift exchange. She'd tried, but Eloise had said she was welcome to stay. Laurel hadn't felt welcome in very many places throughout her life, so she'd stayed. She and Paul didn't have gifts for anyone, and no one would have anything for them. She found she didn't care as she watched Alice present Kristen with a hot water pot.
It's wonderful,
Alice said.
You put in the water and it's hot in about a minute. I know you love your flavored hot chocolates in the winter.
She bent down and hugged Kristen, then turned and picked up a basket that had been hiding beneath her chair.
In fact,
she gave the basket to Kristen, who pulled out different pouches of at least a dozen different types and flavors of hot chocolate. The older woman swiped at her eyes, and Laurel marveled at the relationship between all of them. She'd never done seafaring girls, but she wished now that she had. She wouldn't have been in the same group as everyone else, of course, as she was probably a decade younger than Eloise and her friends. She glanced at Eloise, who sat on the couch with the chief and his girls. She fit there, and Laurel was once again so grateful she hadn't ruined anything between them last fall. Eloise met her eyes, and Laurel smiled quickly before ducking her head. The exchange went on, with Kristen giving a customized planner to Robin. It has all the dates of our birthdays, anniversaries, luncheons, and get-togethers already in it, she said as she sat back down. Robin gazed at the oversized planner as if she'd died and gone to heaven. She opened the front cover and gasped, "Kristen!" She looked up, her eyes wide but so happy. "Where did you get this?" Kristen smiled and said, "Show everyone." Robin held up the book so everyone could see it, gently moving it around the circle of couches and chairs where people sat. "It's us as seafaring girls." "That's the day we did our final test on that yacht," Kristen said fondly, her face a picture of joy. "I found the negatives in a filing cabinet at Rubens, in the lighthouse. I printed a whole bunch of them." She nodded to the planner. "They're inside." Robin leafed through the booklet, stalling only a few seconds later. She grinned and tipped the book up again. "Look, Elle! You and Aaron are in the planner." She showed them, and even Laurel could see the big red heart that had been painted around a date in April. "I need to get in that thing," AJ said, and every eye flew to her. "What?" she asked. "I said Matt and I were talking about marriage."
"Talking is different than being engaged," Alice said, her gaze sliding to Matt.
He shifted a bit, but he didn't say anything. "Let's keep this thing moving," Duke said, patting his wife's knee. "We still have lunch to get through, and the lines at the ferry station are long."
"Right,"
Robin said, though she was definitely communicating something to AJ from way across the room. An hour later, Laurel helped put together the last of the luncheon by taking the spinach and artichoke dip out to the patio. Eloise had bought and installed heaters into the latticework of the pergola that covered the patio. She'd told them about her plans to put flowers in it during the summer months and continue to use the space as much as possible in the winter with the inclusion of the heaters. 2 long tables had been set up between the pillars of the pergola, and all the food had been put there. A couple more tables spread underneath the roof, and teens, kids, and adults milled about. The other cops had come back from their work for lunch, and Laurel put down the dip and migrated toward them. She felt at home at Paul's side, especially when he swept his fingers along her waist in a light touch. She glanced up at him, and he inclined his head toward her. "My sister is planning to meet us at my house this afternoon. We could go together to yours after, if you'd like me there." Laurel's heart skipped a beat. "I would love that, Paul. Thank you." He smiled, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and they both turned toward Kelly as she said, "Okay, everyone, settle down. It's time for our family recipe holiday luncheon." Laurel loved being here. These women reminded her of what it was like to spend time and holidays with family, and also how much she missed doing exactly that. Her parents lived in Nantucket now, and Laurel worked a lot, as Five Island Cove seemed to be a place tourists came for the holidays. She didn't think she'd minded, but now, surrounded by the air and attitude of family, she knew she did. Kelly started explaining the food, saying that Alice had brought her mother's deviled eggs, which apparently she made for Christmas dinner every year. Alice smiled and nodded, and Kelly went on to say she'd made her grandmother's cranberry and walnut cookies. She served them every Sunday afternoon in December, Kelly said, a small smile on her face. "I remember loving them as a little girl, and I decided I'm going to make them every year too." She looked at Robin. "Robin is the queen of the kitchen, and she made the candied ham and cheesy sliced potato casserole. Her mother's been serving ham for Christmas for decades, so that makes it special for our luncheon too. Elle?" "After my dad left," Eloise said, stepping next to Kelly, "my mom and I just made as many dips as we could for Christmas Eve. Queso dips, chili cheese dip, dill dip for veggies, and this spinach and artichoke dip." She gazed at the pan Laurel had carried out, and Laurel could feel the safety and spirit of Eloise's and her mother's special times together. Eloise looked up at her mother, who already sat at a table because of her broken leg. Billy, the chief's oldest daughter, sat next to her, and they looked at one another too, something familial moving through them. Laurel could practically taste it in the air, and there was nowhere she'd rather be than right here. If she couldn't have her family with her, she wanted to be with these people, with Eloise, Alice, Kelly, Robin, Kristen, and AJ. She wondered if that was even possible. She couldn't infiltrate their group, she knew better than that, but they had accepted her, and she hoped she'd be able to find a place where she fit among them. Anyway, Eloise said, it was my favorite, and that's why I made it for us today. AJ didn't cook, but she adored pumpkin pie, so she'd bought one of those to share. There's ice cream in the kitchen, she said. We always had pumpkin pie and ice cream on Christmas night. Her smile said how happy her memory made her. In fact, the day my mother left, my dad served pumpkin pie and ice cream for dinner. That turned the atmosphere down slightly, but AJ kept on smiling. It has good memories and bad, I suppose. But it's a family tradition, so I thought that's what I'd do. Kristen put her hand on AJ's arm, her smile all-knowing. I brought my potato rolls, she said, looking out over everyone. I make them for all kinds of holidays, but always Christmas. Let's eat, Kelly said, and the teenagers swarmed. Laurel stood back, watching them and simply basking in the energy they all brought together. Separate, they were great people. But together, she felt like they were unstoppable. She wanted to be unstoppable too, so when AJ said, "Come eat, Laurel, Paul, come on," Laurel went. It was nice to feel like she was wanted and welcome somewhere. And that was exactly how AJ had just made her feel.
There's a spot here,
Alice said when Laurel turned from the buffet, her plate overflowing with food. Thank you, Laurel said, setting her plate down and giving Alice a smile. Thanks for letting us cops crash your party.
Oh, please, Alice said with a light laugh. You can come to anything you want. In fact, some of us go to lunch every Wednesday.
She put a tiny bite of bread in her mouth.
Of course, Robin sometimes makes us spill all of our secrets, so you might not want to come.
I make you? Robin demanded from a few spots down the table, and Laurel simply laughed. There's tell-alls and new truths and first rights of refusals and all kinds of other things, AJ said as Paul took a seat across from Laurel. Honestly, you should probably ask Aaron to work every Wednesday.
You don't even come to the lunches,
Alice said. I will, AJ said, once I move here.
When is that happening?
Alice asked. AJ glanced over to the buffet where Matt stood talking to Duke. Oh, I don't know, she said airily. And Laurel caught the look of skepticism on Alice's face before she wiped it away. She wasn't sure what that was about, but she didn't know AJ all that well. She knew her name and that she didn't live in Five Island Cove. She knew AJ had played sports and done well, that she'd made a name for herself inside sports journalism, and that she was pregnant with her boyfriend's baby. Laurel had once thought there would be nothing more magical than carrying her boyfriend's baby. She'd been there, though, and she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready to go there again. Her eyes locked on Paul's, and he watched her with one eyebrow slightly higher than the other. I'm sorry, she said, looking left to one of Alice's twins. I missed something.
I'll say, Alice said. Your handsome boyfriend over there asked if you wanted to go to dinner tonight after you assessed the damage on your houses, and you just stared.
An embarrassed flush rose through Laurel, and she defaulted to what she always said. Sorry, I was just thinking about something. She looked up at Paul, catching the quick grin on Alice's face that said she'd been teasing Laurel. I'd love to go to dinner if we can find somewhere on Diamond that's open. You're not going to stay here tonight? Eloise asked, leaning past a couple of people to look toward Laurel. She sounded like she really wanted Laurel to stay another night. Laurel looked down at the shirt she wore. It wasn't hers, and she honestly didn't know who donated it to her. Depends on what my house looks like, she said. I'm up on Browning Road, so I might be okay. We've got to get back to work at some point, Paul said, catching Laurel's eye. We don't even know what the station looks like.
The station is almost cleaned up,
the chief said, his voice carrying easily, though he didn't lean forward like Eloise had.
I've got Mitch and Gina on it. Oh, well, Gina,
Paul said with a grin.
I'm surprised we all don't have detailed to-do lists organized by block per island. Give her until tonight,
the chief said, laughing afterward. Laurel, Paul, and a couple of other cops down by him joined in. On Laurel's other side, AJ and Kelly started talking in low voices about white sands worldwide, and Laurel kept one ear on that conversation. The cop inside her wouldn't just let it go, because she'd seen the look on the chief's face. He hadn't let it go either, and she wouldn't be one bit surprised if he'd already texted someone who had more free time and more privacy than he currently had to dig up anything he or she could find on the charitable organization that sounded too good to be true. Laurel had some personal experience with things like that. Sometimes things that sounded too good to be true started out okay, and then quickly delved into the world of nightmares. So she listened, but she buttered her roll like she wasn't, even when Kristen leaned across the table and joined the conversation.
Chapter 19. Kristen hated the distrust running through her bloodstream. She'd never considered herself a jaded or distrustful person. Her default wasn't that someone was lying to her. When Joel had come home late at night and said he'd been up at the lighthouse going over their quarterly reports, she'd believed him. She hadn't even thought he'd lied to her. Since his death and all the secrets that had come to light, though, Kristen found herself questioning everyone and everything. She hated the doubt circling through her, especially when it was herself she couldn't believe. She'd spoken to Tanya on the phone with everyone listening in. Everyone had heard the phone call, even AJ. She hadn't detected anything nefarious or alarming about the woman's voice, her delivery of the news, or finer details, which, as she listened to AJ and Kelly chat, hadn't really been very fine at all. Or her request to meet on Diamond Island that afternoon. She'd gotten a text just like everyone else. Her phone had simply been on silent, and she hadn't alerted the group to it the way Matthew Hymas had. She sat next to the man, who watched AJ and Kelly too. He didn't say anything, and it wasn't until Kelly asked, "Do you think we shouldn't go?" that Kristen decided to join the conversation. "I think we absolutely should go," she said. "The only way to get more information is to show up to get the information." "I feel like I need a handbook of questions to ask," AJ said, and Kristen felt that deeply. She'd have loved a manual of what to ask when her husband came home late or left early, or didn't want her to go with him when he had to go out to the claw to check the lantern. Sometimes he went in rough waters, and Kristen worried about him the whole time. Sometimes he'd gone during calm seas, and he'd spend a few days there stocking their emergency supplies, topping off fuel, and fixing the shelter. The claw was just a patch of sand out in the water shaped like a rooster's foot, and there was a lantern there to guide boats into the right waters to reach the docks on Diamond Island. There was a rudimentary shelter, but it was waterproof and had a bed and plenty of food and emergency supplies. He could have met any number of women out there, and Kristen would have never known. She'd never asked. She'd never suspected anything. Familiar foolishness ran through her, and she pressed against it mentally. She was tired of feeling like she was the one who'd done something wrong by not suspecting that her otherwise devoted husband was cheating on her. "You didn't do anything wrong," she told herself, for probably the 100th time since Joel had died. "So we'll go," Kelly said, her voice strong enough to pull Kristen out of her damaging thoughts. "Let's make a list of questions before we go, and let's commit to asking anything we can." "I should have brought out my laptop," AJ mused, and Matt reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Tell me why you're suspicious." "Did you see Aaron Sherman?" she asked. "He wasn't jumping up and down for joy, and I don't know, it triggered something inside me. Sometimes there's more to a story." "And sometimes there's not," Matt said, and Kristen nodded before she could tell herself to do it. He glanced at her, and she met his eyes. She didn't know him personally very well, but she knew his parents. They were lifelong residents of Five Island Cove, and his mother was one who'd brought food to the funeral luncheon. She gave him a warm smile, which he returned. He looked back at AJ. Right, babe? You sometimes think you have a story, but when you look further into it, you don't. Yes, AJ admitted. Sometimes.
The point is,
Alice said, joining their conversation from the other side of Laurel. Kristen watched the woman for a few seconds, and anyone who underestimated her would be sorry. Kristen could simply sense the quiet strength inside her. Her dark eyes carried it too, though she didn't speak up much and could easily be forgotten.
we don't know which it is.
Alice finished.
It could be something, but it might not be. We owe it to ourselves to ask all the right questions before signing anything.
What did your callers say when you questioned them? AJ asked. Did they say who the benefactor was?
She would not say.
Alice said.
Carol, the woman who called me, said she actually couldn't disclose that information to anyone. There's something strange about that. If you're literally going to help a group of strangers on a tiny group of islands where you don't live, why can't they know who you are?
Maybe we do know who they are, Kristen said, bringing every eye to her. She didn't normally thrive in the spotlight, but she could handle the heat of it just fine. She looked around at everyone. Just because White Sands is in Canada doesn't mean the benefactor is.
The woman I spoke to the first time said they grew up here.
Alice reached for her glass of sweet tea.
That they wanted to help residents here because they were once one.
There you go, Kristen said. Perhaps they still are, and she just implied they didn't live here anymore. Alice met her eye, and Kristen looked steadily back at her. Alice had a good head on her shoulders, and Kristen usually listened to her. She wasn't sure if she just wanted everyone to have the happily ever after they sorely needed this Christmas, or if she just couldn't stand the thought of another obstacle to overcome, another secret to bring to light, another painful decision to make. Not painful, Kristen thought. Impossible. Well, I'm going to go to the pavilion at 4, Kristen said, groaning as she got to her feet. I'm going to see what they say. Who do you think will be there? AJ asked, and Kristen collected her mostly empty plate and walked away. AJ loved to speculate more than anyone else Kristen had ever met, and she supposed that had helped the woman in her line of work. Right now, all it did was bring a sense of uneasiness to Kristen's stomach she could do without. She put her plate in the large trash can on the edge of the patio, the air much cooler out here, as the heaters didn't extend their arms of warmth quite this far. Kristen ran her hands up her sweatered arms and gazed out over the empty pool to the ocean north of the island. It was a crystal-clear day. Cold, but clear. She could easily see the southern edge of Rocky Ridge, and she started walking toward it. She went past the pool and all the way to the edge of the lawn here at the Cliffside Inn. Eloise had done a good job of getting everything cleaned up and ripped out, and she'd detailed her plans for the spring landscaping at one of their recent lunches. A sense of satisfaction ran through Kristen now, because there was nothing she loved more than seeing her girls and her children achieve their dreams. Eloise had loved the inn growing up, and to see her back here, thriving, in love, with a wedding and a family on the horizon, almost brought Kristen to tears.
I swear I can see my house from here,
Alice said as she stepped next to Kristen. Kristen smiled and folded her arms as another chill scurried across her shoulders. I think it's that one with the light glinting off the big windows out front. There was a light winking into the daylight from the sun's reflection, but it wasn't Alice's. They giggled quietly together, and Kristen did love Alice so dearly. Why are you worried about this opportunity for everyone to get their lives back together? She asked.
I don't know,
Alice said with a sigh.
Only that I am.
Kristen disliked it when Alice said she didn't know something. She usually at least had an inkling of an idea, but she just didn't want to say it out loud. Robin and Duke need that boat. It's the only way they make any money.
I know.
Alice said quietly. Do you? Kristen asked. All the way, Alice? They're living in her mother's house for nearly free, and they barely still make ends meet. She kept her gaze on Rocky Ridge, miles and miles away, half wishing she could walk all the way there.
I didn't know that.
Alice murmured. I know you're not rolling in money anymore, Kristen said. I just wasn't sure if you knew Robin never has.
She's such an amazing woman,
Alice said. And yet you snipe at her every chance you get. Alice sighed, but she didn't deny it.
I love Robin with my whole soul. She knows that. I thought everyone else did too.
We do, Kristen said. I know your bickering is in good fun. She is carrying a huge load right now, and getting a new fishing boat is literally a saving grace for the two of them. Alice let several seconds of silence go by.
Think of how terrible I'll feel if I'm responsible for getting them involved in a charitable organization that isn't so charitable,
she finally said.
I think one reason I'm worried is because it will be my fault if this turns out to be a bad thing.
Kristen nodded, glad the truth had finally been spoken. We're all adults here.
Yes, but Robin and Duke are ready to sign anything that's put in front of them,
Alice said, turning to face Kristen.
That's not smart or responsible, and I don't want them to find themselves in a worse situation because I submitted their names on that stupid form.
You sound like Robin now, Kristen said with a smile, always carrying the weight of everyone when she should just worry about herself. Alice shook her head, her smile barely there.
I spent a lot of years thinking only of myself,
she said.
I try not to do that anymore.
Please, Kristen said. The moment you had those babies, you worked only for them. Alice folded her arms.
I could use some advice about them, actually.
You should talk to Robin, Kristen said, reaching to put her arm around Alice's shoulders. Alice smiled and leaned her head against Kristen's shoulders.
I should. She might know what to do with a daughter who wants to go out with a boy who's no good for her.
Kristen simply stood with her, glad some of Alice's anxiety had disappeared. She was sure they were both thinking about what would happen at 4 o'clock in the downtown park on Diamond Island, and Kristen wondered if it was too early to leave for the ferry station. Behind her, she heard people start to talk and move, and she and Alice turned back to the group. Robin put a stack of plates in the trash, tugged down the sleeves on her hooded sweatshirt, and started toward Alice and Kristen. I'm going to go get my purse, Kristen said. You two have a good chat. She stopped to give Robin a hug. You're leaving? I'm going to get my purse so we can go to the ferry. She smiled. Alice wants to ask you something. Robin wore a dark edge in her eyes as she looked past Kristen to Alice. Kristen patted her on the shoulder. She needs your advice. Do try to remember that they all look to you for help. Robin's eyes rounded, and her gaze flew back to Kristen's, but she was already stepping around Robin. She knew Alice and Robin had been arguing more than usual lately, but deep down, they were the very best of friends. They understood each other on a level most people didn't, because they were so very much alike. Help them sort through things, she whispered to herself as she went inside. She met Dawn Hall in the entryway, struggling to get her left crutch past the edge of the wall. Let me help you. She hurried forward and dislodged the rubber end from where it had stuck. There you go. Dawn stumbled slightly, but her smile came quickly. Thank you, Kristen. How are you? Kristen asked, putting her hand on Dawn's lower back. How's the leg? What can I help you with? I'm going to be just fine, Dawn said, hobbling ever so slowly down the hall to her bedroom at the back of the inn. Thankfully, I can run a foot pedal with both legs, and Eloise is so close now. That is a blessing, Kristen said. Are you excited for the wedding?
Chapter 20. Alice hugged Robin the moment she arrived, her guilt slicing through her chest in a painful wave. "I'm so sorry for arguing with you," she said, "and for saying you make us say things we don't want to say." Robin simply gripped her, and Alice let the silence and emotion between them stitch up the wounds between them. She finally cleared her throat and stepped back. "Kristen said you needed my help with something?" Alice took a moment to press her hand to her mouth, trying to quiet the unrest in the back of her throat. Whenever she had a problem, Robin had helped her. Whenever she'd had to admit very hard things, Robin had encouraged her and said she could weather whatever storm came from the decisions Alice made. No one had helped her more over the summer, as Alice went through her divorce and moved her children back to Five Island Cove, than Robin. "Ginny has a boy who's asked her to a dance," Alice said. "Charlie insists he's not a nice guy and that he sleeps around with a lot of girls, and he's targeting Ginny." Robin said nothing, though she surely had formed an opinion the moment Alice had started speaking. "I don't know what to do. Ginny sometimes feels like I take Charlie's side, and that's what she's accused me of here. Charlie feels the same way from time to time, and I feel stuck." Alice rolled her neck left and right, trying to work the stress and exhaustion from her muscles. "What would you do?" "I have no idea," Robin said, her voice muted and quiet. "Jamie has a mean girl trying to befriend her, and Mandy said this girl has gone through a lot of girls, using them up and spitting them out. Sounds similar, except one's a girl and one's a boy." "Who's the boy?" "Cameron Heights." Alice hadn't said another word to Ginny about him since yesterday morning, but she'd need to before her daughter went back to school after the new year. Robin hummed in such a way that led Alice to believe she knew the boy or his family. "I'm going to go with Charlie on this one, Alice. Mandy told me that he went to the movies with her group once, and he tried to kiss every girl, her included, before the night ended." Alice sighed, her mind racing now. How could she gently lead Ginny to the idea that she couldn't go out with this boy? "Sometimes they have to make their own mistakes," Robin said. "Not this kind," Alice said, her thoughts going down dark roads where she had to take her daughter to the hospital and make a police report of a sexual assault. She'd protect Ginny from that at any cost. It was worth her daughter being angry at her for the rest of her life, if that was what it took. "How are you feeling about Charlie and Mandy?" Alice asked. They regularly spoke about their children dating one another, just so they could be on the same page when it came to the relationship. "Good," Robin said, finally tearing her gaze from the horizon to look at Alice. She looked tired, with plenty of lines around her eyes. Alice wanted to wrap her in a hug and tell her she'd fix everything. She couldn't, though. Not this time. "Charlie is a good boy," Robin said. "He's respectful to me and Duke, and he respects Mandy. Doesn't mean he won't sleep with her." Robin shrugged. "You know, I used to be so worried about that. Mandy's a pretty girl with lots of curves. She's had boys coming by the house for a few years now. Charlie's by far the best of them." She smiled at Alice. "You've done a great job with him." "Thank you," Alice murmured, her eyebrows drawing down. "You're not worried about them having sex?" Robin shrugged again, and Alice thought she was in really bad shape. "I don't think it's the worst thing that could happen, Alice. I really don't." "You're kidding." Alice gaped at her, her eyes widening as they tried to take in more of Robin's face in an attempt to understand. "Robin, what is wrong with you?" "I think," Robin met Alice's eyes, pure fear in hers. "I think sometimes there are bigger problems than two teenagers who mutually agree to an intimate relationship." "This is about Duke's boat." Robin looked away, but Alice saw the darkness in her eyes anyway. "We need a fishing boat." Alice nodded because she couldn't argue. People needed a place to live, too. Matt's family needed their golf course to be open to pay their bills. Dawn needed her sewing machines. Out of everyone, Alice's situation was very low on the scale, and she recommitted herself to helping her friends in any way she could. "I just need to ask a few questions this afternoon," Alice said carefully. I don't want you and Duke to get into an even tougher situation.
I appreciate that, Alice, Robin said.
I do.
We need that boat, and I'm going to do everything I can to get it.
She turned around and patted Alice's shoulder. No matter what you ask and what the answers are, I'm going to do anything and everything in my power to replace my husband's fishing boat. She walked away, and Alice felt like the earth between them was splitting with every step she took, creating a chasm that she'd never be able to bridge. A couple of hours later, Alice disembarked from the ferry along with everyone else. They'd had to wait through 2 other ferries, and they'd be very lucky to make it to the pavilion by 4 o'clock. Alice had decided to leave her twins at the inn, and they'd kept Parker, Mandy, and Jamie with them. Aaron had brought his girls with him, as they hadn't been back to Diamond Island since the tsunami, and they all wanted to see the state of their home. After the meeting in the park, Eloise would go with them to the house, and the group would split up. Alice wasn't sure why, but she didn't want Laurel and Paul to go. She didn't want the other cops to return to their homes. She wanted everyone to come back to the inn that evening, though they had no dinner planned the way they'd done when they'd all stayed at her house on Rocky Ridge. She liked being with good people, and she liked talking to her friends. She didn't want to go by the house she was supposed to be moving into next week, and she didn't want to see the state of the things she and the twins had moved over the past few weekends. Still, her feet moved her, and she got in the first rideshare she could, cramming inside next to Kelly and Kristen in the back seat of a sedan. Aaron, Eloise, and the girls had taken the car in front of them, and Laurel, Paul, and all the cops got the extended rideshare in the form of a minivan behind them. Alice could admit her nerves, but she didn't. Not out loud. She also didn't show them on the outside, ever. She'd learned to box them up very early in her life, and she was still very good at it. I think I'm going to go out to Rocky Ridge for Christmas, she said to Kelly. Are you going to see your mother?
Yes,
Kelly said.
That was the plan, and her house wasn't too badly damaged.
She smiled at Alice and reached over to squeeze her hand.
I know you're just trying to do what's right.
I don't want to hurt you, Alice said, looking away. I'll just keep my questions to myself. Everyone's going to make their own decisions anyway. I'm going to do anything and everything in my power to replace my husband's fishing boat. Alice would have done the same for Frank once upon a time. Robin loved Duke very much, and it was actually a nice reminder for Alice to see it. Before she knew it, the driver of the car pulled up to the park with the words,
Diamond downtown.
Thank you,
Kristen said, already paying for the ride. Alice wished she wouldn't. She wasn't sure how much money Kristen had, but she didn't need to pay for everyone's ride. Alice got out of the car and held the door for Kelly. After closing the door, she faced the park. Eloise and Aaron were already there, of course. Matt, AJ, Duke, and Robin got out of another car just down the street, and they started across the wet grass toward the pavilion. Everywhere Alice looked, she saw evidence of water and debris. The people on this island had been busy cleaning up, the same way they had been on Sanctuary. She wasn't sure what her new house looked like, but in that moment it didn't matter. She'd clean it up and get it habitable, just like everyone else. She wasn't going to quit. She wasn't going to let a little salt water ruin her life or change her plans. She held her head high as she walked down the sidewalk toward the pavilion, where it seemed no one else was. It certainly wasn't warm enough to bring children to a park to play, and everyone else had so much work to do they weren't out enjoying the winter sunshine.
Alice?
Someone behind her said. She turned at the sound of her name in an unfamiliar male voice. Kelly, who walked in front of her, stopped walking too, coming to Alice's side. A man had just gotten out of a car, and he'd turned back to pay the driver. He was tall, with a head full of sandy blonde hair and a dark blue jacket straining across his broad shoulders and narrowing at his waist. He turned back to her, and Alice knew who he was instantly. Her heartbeat stopped completely, and heat filled her face. "Will," she said.
Oh, Kelly whispered. He's looking at you like he wants to kiss you right now.
Alice didn't even look at her as she stepped back the way she'd come.
Alice!
Will said again, grinning. He jogged the last few steps to her and wrapped her in a hug as he laughed. Alice had no idea what to do with such happiness and joy. She couldn't remember the last time a man had even smiled in her direction, not to mention laughing as they greeted her. She felt stiff in his arms, and he stepped back quickly.
Sorry, are you not a hugger?
He looked at her with those dark, navy, dazzling eyes she definitely remembered.
Seems like I remember you being a hugger.
Hugging is fine, Alice said, reaching up to tuck her hair behind her ear, suddenly feeling very out of place. She could only hear the comments from Charlie and Ginny about his daughter, and she wondered if she should break things off between the two of them before anything even started. The way her blood pulsed through her veins, though, and Alice didn't want to do that. She lifted her head and looked him right in the eyes. "It's so good to see you." She hugged him again, this time joining in with him as he laughed. "Sorry, that was a weird greeting. I'm surprised to see you here." She pulled away and looked down to his casual tennis shoes and back to his face. He wore a pair of jeans with his jacket zipped up so she couldn't see his shirt. He was so not Frank, and Alice really liked that. At the same time, her heart sank all the way to the cold cement at her feet. If Will was here, his nomination had been selected too.
I got a phone call from someone at this place where they're helping people impacted by the tsunami,
He said easily.
White Sands Worldwide? I'm supposed to get more details here.
He looked past her to the pavilion while Alice's throat dried up. Why hadn't he texted her that he'd gotten a phone call? He's really busy, she told herself. He was responsible for all the water transportation in the cove, which was significant.
They say they can help get the ferry system all the way operational with a little bit of money and some extra manpower to help get things cleaned up quick.
He grinned at her and reached out as if he'd tuck her hair. He did just that, sending fire cascading down the side of her neck and into her rib cage.
What are you doing here? Chapter 21. Eloise looked over her shoulder to where Alice and Will had stopped on the sidewalk. She really wished she could transform into a fly in that moment and buzz around to hear what they were talking about. Her own heart pounded, and she forced herself to turn around. No one waited for them in the pavilion, though, and Robin's anxiety had started to wear on Eloise's patience. The girls wouldn't last long here, and Eloise pulled out her phone to check the time. 2 minutes until the clock ticked to 4. White Sands Worldwide seemed like the type of organization that would be prompt, and Eloise swallowed back her own nerves. "Billy," Aaron said, "why don't you and Grace take my card and go get a soda?"
"Really?"
Billy asked, and Aaron smiled at his daughter. He took his wallet out of his back pocket and withdrew the card. He handed it to his eldest and said, "Do not leave Grace behind. Stay together."
"Do you want something?"
Billy asked, tucking the card into the back pocket of her jeans. She pulled down the ends of her hat to cover her ears. "Yes," Aaron said with a smile. "You know what I like."
"Elle?"
Billy asked, and she loved hearing her nickname in the girl's voice. "I want strawberry basil lemonade," she said, "if you're going to Station 99.
"Got it,"
Billy said, and she reached for Grace's hand. The two girls walked away, and Eloise couldn't help the fondness for them that filled her.
"It's just us."
Alice said as she stepped next to Eloise.
"Did you notice that?"
"What?" Eloise asked. Alice wore a look of fear and anger at the same time.
"Sasha Summers called me and said she had a form people could fill out for the grants. I didn't tell anyone else about it, but she said she was going to call other people."
She glanced around, her expression turning darker and darker.
"She obviously didn't. We're the only ones here. The 7 people I submitted. That's it. We've all been chosen. We're the only ones who've been chosen."
Eloise looked around, and sure enough, there wasn't anyone there besides the people Alice had nominated for the disaster relief. "I'm not sure that's a bad thing," she said. Maybe she just figured she'd gotten enough nominations and she didn't call anyone else to let them know about the project.
I need to call her.
Alice said, already swiping on her phone, though she hadn't saved the number. An ache spread through Eloise's body, causing a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. She instinctively curled into herself, and Aaron noticed. His eyebrows went up, and Eloise just gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She loved him so much. And when her brother had shown up at the inn a few months ago, breathing threats and knowing every little iota of business she and each of her friends were involved in, Eloise had turned inward. She'd narrowed down to what was the most important things to her, and she'd landed on her relationship with Aaron, his girls, her mother, and her friends. She would sacrifice anything for them. And she'd given Garrett what he wanted, all the property he and their father had amassed through their illegal card games at the inn. All the money. Eloise sometimes thought about what her life, and the lives of those she loved, would be like with the money. She would have been able to help Robin and Duke with their fishing boat, and they wouldn't be standing under this pavilion in the freezing cold, waiting for an unknown savior. She could have helped Alice so she could keep the vacation home she and her children had been living in. Alice claimed not to care about the house, but Eloise didn't see how that was possible. Alice had always liked nice things, expensive things, and she'd never apologized for it. Eloise glanced at her now, and she could simply feel the unrest that existed in Alice, though she hid it masterfully. She looked around at everyone there, and they all held such a special place in her heart. She wanted only what was best for all of them, as well as her mother, whom she'd left at the inn with all the kids. Worry darted through her, but she reasoned that her mother had a phone, and there were plenty of people to help should she or the children need it. Eloise had gotten to know her neighbors up on Cliffside Drive over the last 6 months, and they were all very nice people. Robin and Duke wore the most worry in their faces, as well as the most hope. As their contribution to the activities, they'd taken the movie night for that evening, back at the inn. AJ had suggested they could bring popcorn or brownies, and she knew Robin would have something delicious to present. Eloise was making blueberry pancakes and candied bacon for tomorrow's breakfast, and she was glad Paul had volunteered to help. He'd been a good friend to Aaron for many years, and Eloise could see why they got along so well. Alice had said she and Kristen would take care of the last, final dinner tomorrow evening, and then everyone would leave on Wednesday morning to make room for Eloise's first guests at the Cliffside Inn. Her stomach flipped, as it had been doing every time she thought about having real, paying guests at the inn again. There would be no gentlemen's club this time, and no dastardly card games. Just good food, a family atmosphere, and the peace Eloise had always felt at the inn. She'd been living in the small suite behind the inn, but come April, things would have to change. The apartment wasn't big enough for a family of 4, and Aaron needed to live on Diamond Island. Eloise hadn't made a final decision yet, but she suspected that she'd hire a manager to live in that suite. She'd thought about offering it to the chef. No matter what, she needed someone who could be on site for any issues. It really all depended on whether or not she could keep the Cliffside Inn full and thriving. "They're late," someone said, and Eloise glanced down at her phone again. Sure enough, it was after 4, and she twisted to look behind her again. Another vehicle hadn't arrived, and she'd have known by now anyway, as cars made noise. Another minute ticked by, and then another, and the tension riding in the air increased with each breath.
How long do we wait?
Alice asked, and Robin threw her a dirty look. Surprisingly, Kristen did too, and Eloise simply watched everyone. She was very comfortable on the outside, and she often picked up cues from other people by keeping her eyes open and her mouth closed. "Elle," Aaron said very quietly, "I have a bad feeling about this." "Should we go?" she whispered. "The girls aren't back yet." Some of her apprehension belonged to what they might find at his house. There didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to how some buildings had been damaged while others hadn't, and all she'd been able to do was pray. He'd asked his parents to take Prince, his dog, and Aaron wanted to stop by there too. first to check on his parents, and second to get the dog he loved. Eloise wasn't sure if they'd make it back to Sanctuary tonight, and she told herself it was okay. The ferries started early, and she could get back and get breakfast going in plenty of time. Alice said something quietly to Will, and they started talking in low voices. Alice trilled out a laugh, and Eloise stared at her in surprise. She hadn't seen Alice flirt with a man in a very long time, and she started to giggle too. She turned into Aaron's chest to stifle the sound, and he asked, "Do you hear that?" Eloise pulled away, and she cocked her head to the side, trying to hear what he did. "Sounds like a helicopter." Kelly and Kristen moved toward the edge of the concrete and stepped onto the soggy grass. They looked up into the sky, and Kristen said, "It's a helicopter, and it's coming this way." Everyone bustled out from under the roof of the pavilion and looked up into the sky, even Eloise. She'd seen helicopters before, of course, but for some reason, none of them could look away from this one. "Are they going to land that thing right here?" AJ asked.
Is that legal? Can they do that?
There were too many people there for Eloise to identify all the voices as people continued to chatter and ask questions that no one answered. The chopping sound of the blades came closer and closer, growing louder and louder as the helicopter itself grew larger with each passing moment. Eloise found it remarkable that such a vehicle could fly at all, and she watched the hulking black machine in the bright blue sky with a bit of wonder amidst all the uncertainty streaming through her. She ducked behind Aaron, and everyone stepped back inside the pavilion as the helicopter made ready to land right there in the park. Aaron's phone rang, and he pulled it from his pocket. "Yes?" he said, practically yelling. He said a couple of other things, but she couldn't hear him over the deafening noise of the helicopter. He hung up and turned his back on the park and the vehicle that had just touched down. "Eloise!" he yelled. "We need to go." "Go?" she yelled back. "They just got here." "We don't want to be here." She didn't understand, and he said something else she couldn't hear. She shook her head, and Aaron's frustration showed all over his handsome face. He tapped furiously on his phone and held it up for her to see. "I just talked to Ben, and he said the benefactor is Diane Proctor." Eloise read the sentence over and over, her confusion doubling. "Diane Proctor?" she asked, but no one could hear her. She knew that name, but it wouldn't come forward and remind her of how. Aaron's mouth moved, and he typed on his phone again. He held it up, but the blades had started to slow, and the group had begun to inch forward again. She stepped past Aaron without looking at his phone, which he hadn't held up again anyway. 3 people had already stepped out of the helicopter and were currently hurrying toward the pavilion with their hands up to cover their bent heads. They all wore extremely professional clothing in dark blue or black, and Eloise hadn't seen such pressed slack or suffocating skirt suits in a while. She'd been wearing jeans and ratty t-shirts for months, and she worked with a variety of handymen, tradesmen, and others who dressed the same way she did to get their jobs done. Robin stepped forward first, of course, and she shook the hand of the lead blonde woman, both of them smiling like jackals. Aaron put his hand on Eloise's waist, but they couldn't leave now. "Eloise," he said anyway, with a hefty dose of warning in his voice. The helicopter finally powered all the way down, and another woman disembarking from the helicopter drew her attention. She carried prestige and power in her step and the stance of her shoulders, and it was clear to Eloise that she'd be the one funding all of the projects in 5 Island Cove. A few people were still exchanging pleasantries with the other 3 people who'd arrived first, but it didn't take long for everyone to turn their attention to the tall, blonde woman wearing a pair of gray slacks, a pair of black heels, and a long duster jacket that clearly cost thousands of dollars. She was Alice times 10, with probably millions more dollars than Alice had enjoyed in her prime. She wore her wealth in the set of her smile and the way her eyes didn't crinkle with the movement. Her arms swung naturally at her sides, as if she'd made many walks like this before and knew exactly how to do it. Her hair fell below her shoulders in straight, shiny strands, and Eloise half expected a stylist and makeup artist to emerge from the helicopter too, because this woman was exquisite. Eloise took a step toward her, because she also seemed somewhat familiar. "Elle," Aaron said again. She ignored him, because AJ had just let out a shriek filled with horror and despair. She stepped past Matt, though he said, "AJ, what's wrong? Is it the baby?" She stopped just past the group that had gathered, and Eloise saw her fingers curl into fists. She had a power stance too, and hers was much more aggressive than the other woman's. Everything made sense when she asked, "Mother?" Chapter 22. AJ couldn't believe her eyes. This could not be happening. This person she hadn't heard from or seen in 35 years could not be standing in front of her. Her heartbeat sprinted through her body, and her heart itself thrashed against the cage her ribs made around it. What was she supposed to say? How was she supposed to feel? How dare her mother come here, dressed like she owned the world, with a grand entrance in a helicopter she wouldn't dare get out of until the blades had stopped. AJ wasn't sure if she should find the nearest object she could and hurl it at her mother's perfect face, or rush toward her and wrap her arms around her. The feelings shot through her at the speed of light, and her thoughts were so tangled she couldn't make sense of anything. "Mother?" someone repeated, but AJ honestly couldn't decipher vocal tones at this point. Someone touched her and she jerked away from it. "Hello, Ava Jane," her mother said, not denying that she was, in fact, Diane Proctor. "Thank you so much for coming," another woman said, her voice as fake as plastic. She wore a false smile, too, and AJ's stomach heaved. "I'm going to be sick," she said with a moan, and she turned around. Thankfully, Matt was there, and he took her into his arms to support her. "Come sit down," he said, but AJ didn't want to sit down. She wanted to know why her mother was there. "I'm Marion Usher," the other woman continued, and AJ could still feel Diane's eyes on her. "Not all of our account managers could come, but I'm going to be talking with Kelly and Will." "I'm Forrest Bell," a man said. "I need Eloise and Duke with me."
"Right here,"
Robin chirped, and AJ couldn't believe her. She turned back to watch Robin step to the man's side. Duke went with her, but no one else had moved at all. AJ's numbness started to wear off, though it had only started a few moments ago. "I'm Carol Grady," the last woman said. "I have Alice and Kristen with me."
"Who's she?"
Alice asked, her voice tight and professional. "I'm Sasha Summers."
"Why did AJ call you mother?"
Alice asked. "Because I'm her mother." "We're leaving," Aaron said before Alice could ask anything else, and AJ watched as he and Eloise looked at one another. They had an entire conversation without saying anything, and Eloise finally nodded, acceptance spreading through her expression. Eloise held AJ's gaze for a moment, then another. "Why are you leaving?" Forrest asked, obviously confused. "We're not taking any money from AJ's mother," Eloise said. She surveyed the whole group. "None of you should. Do you know who she is? Do you realize what she's done?" "Eloise," AJ said, not sure why she didn't want her to say anything badly about her mother. Perhaps AJ wanted to outline in detail all the horrible things she'd dealt with over the years, the pure inadequacy she'd suffered, the hours of time and thousands of dollars she'd spent in therapy, the hundreds of men she'd slept with as a way to try to forget that she'd been abandoned by the one person who wasn't supposed to ever leave her.
"Will you be the one funding the projects?"
Alice asked, her eyes never leaving Diane. AJ didn't want to cower in her boyfriend's arms, and she straightened to face her mother. She had so many things and people she needed to face, and she had to be strong even when she didn't feel like she could be. Without her medication, every day and every hour was harder than normal. "Be strong for the baby," she told herself. "Be strong for yourself." Her mother had the audacity to come here, and surely she'd known AJ would be there. She'd known her false identity would be revealed. "What do you want?" she asked. Diane's eyes went right back to her, and AJ held the gaze steadily.
She could still remember the last time she'd seen her mother, and she'd seemed so big back then, so powerful and so wonderful. She'd kissed AJ goodbye in the morning before school, and she'd been gone in the afternoon. She'd left a note for the family, which her father had burned a few years later on his birthday, claiming it was his gift to himself to finally move past the woman who'd ruined his life and his children's lives. He'd taken to drinking a lot more after that, and AJ hadn't thought he'd really moved past much of anything. AJ had fended for herself through much of high school, as Ryan was older than her and gone by the time she was a sophomore. She'd watched out for Amy as much as she could, and she'd spent time with the boys that made her forget her situation and helped her feel good about herself. She'd left the Cove the moment she could. "I want to help the people in Five Island Cove." Diane adjusted the designer purse she carried on her forearm.
"You only told me about the nomination form," Alice said. "You knew who I was, and you knew I'd nominate all my friends."
Diane turned to Alice and gave her a winning smile. "Yes, dear, you did great." AJ couldn't stand the idea of her mother making Alice feel small, and she watched Alice shrink right in front of her. "Get back on the helicopter and go," AJ said, stepping forward again. She'd protected Amelia from Joel. She'd stepped out of line in college and in her job, too. She had to in order to get the interviews she wanted, or stand up to coaches who'd pushed the team too hard. She was tired of being pushed around. "All of you," she added, "we're not interested in my mother's money. By the way, her name is Diane Proctor, not Sasha Summers." She scoffed at the ridiculous name. In her mind's eye, she watched their Christmas miracles disappear into a white horizon. Matt's golf course would simply find another way to get cleaned up and reopened. Kelly could find another way to get a new place to live. "Ava Jane," her mother said in a placating voice that grated against AJ's nerves, "don't be like this. These people need help, and they're not going to turn it away because you don't like me." "I don't like you?" AJ said, her voice full of incredulity. She started to laugh, aware of how manic it sounded. "My name is not Ava Jane, Diane. It's AJ. You'd know that if you hadn't abandoned me and my two siblings when we were children." She turned back to Diane's coworkers. "Did she tell you this story? That she walked out on us one day and she has literally never once looked back?" She glared at her mother, feeling wild and out of control. "Seems like she went off and found herself someone else to use. A rich man, I suppose. She is a horrible, terrible person, and no, I don't like her. But that's not even a strong enough word." She folded her arms. "I hate her." "Ava Jane," her mother started. "It's AJ," AJ barked. "I don't have to stand here and listen to a single thing you say." She turned and started to march away, expecting everyone to follow her. Only one set of footsteps did, and she wasn't surprised when Matt caught up to her. "I came to see if we could patch things up," Diane called after her, and AJ spun back to her. "Patch things up?" she said, practically running back toward her mother. "Patch things up?" She came within feet of her mom, who now wore a slightly scared expression. "You patch things up with a friend you miscommunicated with about lunch, or a boyfriend you didn't text back the way you should have." Her chest heaved, but her mind suddenly cleared. "You left me, Diane. You abandoned me and walked away from your whole life because you didn't want your children, husband, or life anymore. Who does that?" She shook her head and let her gaze slide down her mother's tight, trim body. She'd probably had plenty of surgery to look the way she did, because AJ knew Botox when she saw it. Her mother's face barely moved, for crying out loud. "You're an awful person. The worst type there is. Paying to drain a golf course isn't going to change that." "I was hoping we could talk," Diane said. "You're delusional," AJ shot back. "There's no chance of forgiveness. How does one erase the past 35 years and call it okay?" AJ shook her head. "You're delusional and stupid." She didn't have anything else to say, which surprised her. She'd thought a lot about what she might say or do if she ever came in contact with her mother again. But now that she was faced with the very woman that had caused her the most damage in her life, she had nothing to say. She scanned her mother again. all the way down to her expensive heels, turned, and walked away. Hours later, she'd cried more than she had in the few days after she'd learned she was pregnant. Matt had speculated that her mother had found out somehow, and that was why she wanted to make amends now. AJ didn't much care why. She wasn't going to sit down to lunch with her mother and patch things up. As she curled into the couch and looked out Matt's front window, a fresh wave of emotion rolled through her. She didn't want to face the past. She wanted to leave it lying where it was so she could step forward into a new future as a wife to a wonderful man and mother to a baby she'd always dreamt of having. At the same time, terror's tight grip on her heart kept whispering that she'd never be a good mother, because she'd had a mother who couldn't stick around long enough to teach her how to love a child. Tears streamed down her face again, because no one had followed her and Matt. She'd left them all standing at the pavilion, and even when the rideshare car had come to take them to Matt's parents' house, they'd all still been there, talking to the 4 people who'd come to rescue them. AJ drifted in and out of consciousness as she dozed. Matt had gone to the golf course with his father, leaving AJ alone in his house. It hadn't suffered too much damage. The water line came up 3 feet on the house, but the front door sat up 7 steps, and none of the salty ocean water had entered his home. Therefore, everything was dry and habitable, and AJ wiped her face as she experienced a wave of gratitude for that. She'd been going back and forth in her decisions for the past couple of hours, and once again, she thought she needed to get out to Pearl Island. Now. A voice boomed in her mind, and AJ stood up. Her face felt like someone had packed mud on it and let it dry, and as she moved, her skin cracked. She didn't take time to pack. The ferry system was operating on reduced hours, and if she wanted to be on Pearl that evening, she needed to go now. Luckily, a rideshare car sat right around the corner, and she made it on the last ferry from Diamond to Pearl. During the ride, she texted Matt. "I had to go see my sister. I'm fine, and I'll let you know when I'll be back." It wouldn't be that night, and AJ realized she'd left the house without a change of clothing, a toothbrush, or a plan of any kind. Her nerves buzzed, and she felt sick to her stomach again. She'd normally stand when she rode the ferry, enjoying the crisp sea breeze in her face. Today, though, she sat indoors, the weather and darkness too much for AJ to endure. She had to wait for a ride on Pearl, and she had to look up her sister's address to give it to the driver. Soon enough, she stood on the front porch of her sister's house, her fist raised to knock. She'd started her trip to the cove with a scenario so much like this one, and AJ dug down deep to find the well of courage she needed to rap on the door. Knock, 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 knock. "Just a second," someone yelled from inside, and AJ's chest vibrated as she took a breath. A few seconds later, or maybe a minute, AJ wasn't sure of time anymore, the door opened. A girl no older than 7 or 8 stood there, and AJ saw the Proctor jeans plainly in her face. She had no idea what to say to her niece, as her emotions hung on a thread already. "Who is it?" Amy called, and AJ broke into a sob. The little girl scampered away, closing the door in AJ's face. She told herself to get it together. She couldn't break down and act like a lunatic on someone's front porch. "Did she say—" Amy asked as she opened the door again. "She might need help." She met AJ's eyes, and Amy stilled. "Oh." She looked down to AJ's feet and back to her face. "I do need help," AJ said, glad her voice had worked. "Mom's in the cove, and I didn't know where else to go." Amy's eyes widened, and she stepped out onto the porch. "Mom's back in the cove? Where?" She actually seemed eager to go see her. "Somewhere on Diamond," AJ said as a gust of wind kicked up. Combined with the winter darkness, it made it far too cold to stand around on the porch talking. "Did you see her? What did she say?" "She showed up to save me and my friends from all the damage the tsunami did." Amy gasped and covered her mouth. "You're kidding." "I wish." AJ shivered. and she held her purse tight against her chest. "Come in," Amy said, stepping back. "Darcy, go heat some water for coffee." "No coffee," AJ said. "It gives me heartburn." Amy cocked her head, her expression troubled. "You love coffee." "I know," AJ said. "I do. It's just the baby doesn't like it." She put one hand on her stomach, and Amy's eyes bulged out of her head. "You're pregnant?" AJ nodded, more tears threatening to flow down her face. She stepped inside the house, noticing how perfectly warm and quaint it was. "What are we going to do about Mom?" "Come tell me everything," Amy said. "Mary, we need hot chocolate."
Can I have some?
Another little girl asked.
The kind with the marshmallows?
"Yes," Amy said, though AJ got the distinct impression she would have normally said no. She glanced at Amy as they walked through the living room and into the kitchen. "Donovan's down at the restaurant, but I can call him to come home." "You do what you want," AJ said. "Girls, you remember your Aunt AJ, don't you?" Amy nodded to the older girl who'd answered the door. "Darcy will get you a mug. Mary, ask her what kind of hot chocolate she wants." Amy was so good at giving information without seeming like she was, and AJ loved her powerfully in that moment. As her girls did what she asked, AJ stepped over to her and grabbed her in a hug. "I miss you," she said, letting her tears flow. "I'm so sorry I've disappeared too." Amy held her tight, the two of them seemingly unwilling to be the first to let go. "I'm a mess," AJ continued. "I'm not married and pregnant with Matt Hymas's baby. His golf course is mostly underwater, and our mother pretended to be someone else so she could come here and rescue me." AJ hadn't even realized she felt that way until she vocalized it. She'd often felt like she needed to be rescued, but she certainly didn't want that help to come in the form of the person who'd held her underwater for so long. She stepped away from Amy, noting the fear in her younger sister's eyes. AJ collapsed at the kitchen table and let her niece put a mug in front of her. "Thank you, Darcy." She hugged the little girl and let Mary show her the flavors of hot chocolate they had. With hot water in her mug and the marshmallow mint powder getting stirred in, Amy said, "Start at the beginning with Mom." She glanced down to AJ's stomach. "We'll get to Matt Hymas." She grinned and lifted her mug to her lips. AJ felt a flicker of joy when she thought of Matt, but he was quickly dampened with images of her mother in those fancy clothes, her hair stunningly perfect, and her almost disdainful voice making the reason why she and AJ didn't have a relationship AJ's fault. "I used to think I wanted Mom to come back," AJ said, standing in front of her, though, and I don't know. She sighed. "Do you think there are times when we just can't forgive each other?" Amy finished swallowing and set her mug on the table. "Honestly, AJ?" "Yes," AJ whispered. "Honestly, Amy, tell me honestly." "Yes," she said. "Sometimes our own self-preservation has to come before forgiving someone who hurt us so badly that we'd be damaged again by doing so." She reached over and put her hand over AJ's. It was so comforting, and AJ disliked herself for not coming to visit more often. AJ nodded and smiled at her sister. "I'm sorry I'm such a mess." "I know who you are, AJ," Amy said, withdrawing her hand. "You do the best you can, and I've always known and appreciated that." She stood. "Now, I do have a pizza noodle casserole in the oven, and you haven't even started the story about Mom yet." AJ almost didn't want to tell it. At the same time, there was no safer place than her sister. Someone else her mother had left behind and had likely never thought about again. That thought alone was enough to get her to open her mouth and start the story about the phone call Alice had gotten just yesterday.
You've been listening to the second part of Christmas at the Cove by Jessie Newton. Look for the third and concluding part of this audiobook right here on the Feel Good Fiction audiobook channel.